This course is based on the textbook Nutrition for Healthcare Professionals, An Introduction to Disease Prevention. The textbook can be purchased as a softcover at the university bookstore, or it can also be purchased as both a softcover and an ebook directly from Kendall Hunt Publishing. It's an excellent introductory textbook to the causes and treatments of many nutrition-based chronic diseases. Inside the textbook cover is an access code that gives students free access to a bank of training quizzes and to the documentary A Diabetic Nation. The 20th and 21st centuries have been marked by a significant growth in chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and many cancers, all stemming from the obesity epidemic, now ravaging the very fabric of American society. Currently, 71% of American adults are either overweight or obese, and shockingly, 33% of children ages 2 to 19 are overweight or obese. The link between disease and lifestyle is so real that epidemiologists estimate that between 65 to 85% of all cancers are associated with obesity, diet, or tobacco. This understanding of the contemporary origins of disease places a significant importance on the role of prevention. Indeed, strictly from an economic point of view, it is far more financially advantageous to prevent a disease than it is to cure it. To understand how to prevent disease, it's perhaps timely to look back briefly at the dietary evolution of our hominid ancestors. Many archaeobotanists have argued that the Paleolithic man ate mostly berries and plants and some meats and was essentially nomadic. The diet makeup, some have suggested, consisted of carbohydrates representing 22 to 40% of calories, protein 19 to 35, and fats 25 to 59% of calories. Now, disagreement arises over whether the Paleolithic diet was low in carbohydrates. Indeed, because of the massive berries and plants consumed, the carbohydrate intake would have been more likely 44 to 64% of calories. Suffice to say that the glycemic index would have been low. Moreover, the level of exercise associated with these people would have been very elevated. The transition now to the Neolithic period would have caused a shift from nomadic lifestyle to agricultural communities with significantly less physical activity compared to the constant activity of the Paleolithic nomadic lifestyle. So this combination of agriculture and low activity would have been the mix that began to cause disease rates to increase, in part because of the lower physical activity, but also because of the narrower food selection, causing less access to varied micronutrients. Additionally, the cultivation of grains with higher glycemic indexes could have been at the source of some medical problems, but it would not have created a surge in chronic diseases or widespread malnutrition. Plain and simple, the Homo erectus of the Paleolithic period would have likely have been physically fit beyond anything observable during the Neolithic period. Plus, he would have consumed many foods with a low glycemic index. By comparison to our current protein intake, we could see that the Paleolithic man is approximately consuming the same amount of protein as we do now. It's certain once agricultural societies emerged, the disease rates began to increase. By the classical Greek period, beginning around 500 BC, Greek thinkers began to reflect about diseases. This notion of nutrition, critical in disease prevention, upheld as a preventative and medicinal approach by the physicians of the Greek classical period, 500 to 336 BC, was rooted in the understanding that human disease was intertwined with the imbalance of nature. The pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles of Agrigentum, 490 to 430 BC, advanced that the four elements, water, fire, earth, and air, were critical in man's understanding of the universe and of his own biology. The Empedoclean model of water, fire, earth, and air advanced that there was a link with the characteristics of the four seasons, cold, moist, hot, and dry, and thus the four humors of the body. The idea was that an imbalance in the humors could only come from disruption in the cold, moist, hot, dry properties of the body that were linked to nature. Hippocrates, a little time later, 460 to 375 BC, universally considered as the father of medicine, adopted the model to a more practical hands-on approach to understanding disease and healing. In that sense, he proposed that an imbalance between the humors would lead to sickness, an idea upheld by Plato and Aristotle in later years. The humors were identified as specific fluids within the body. First, the black bile, related to earth with cold and dry properties. Then the yellow bile, related to fire with dry and warm properties. Next, the blood, related to air with moist and warm qualities. And the phlegm, related to water with moist and cold qualities. Hippocrates, influenced by the teachings of Herodotus, 500 BC, believed in both the importance of diet and exercise for good health. He writes, "Eating alone will not keep a man well. He must also take exercise." Plato continued to advocate for the balance of the humors and of the moderating of hot and cold, moist, and dry properties of the body. However, he introduces the notion of diseases of secondary formations originating from insufficient food or drink to replenish the blood. Most significantly, Plato proposes a fourth cause of disease: imbalances of the soul and mind. Here we witness, during the classical Greek period, evidence that the early medical discipline had already understood the importance of psychological health. Although these concepts were underived from experimentation, but only from rational thought or reason, they clearly introduced a medical model that endured up until the 19th century. Still today, many aspects of this Greek medical model are upheld by the medical field. Beginning with the understanding that excess and deficiencies in diet and exercise can actually lead to disease. Hippocrates understood this. Back in the Greek classical period, he documented obesity, which he termed corpulence. In addition, the Greeks introduced this idea of balance or homeostasis. The relationship with the world around us needs to be in balance in order to balance the humors, because an imbalance of humors would actually lead to disease. Now, although this is physiologically incorrect, they did understand the aspect of balance which we upheld today with a greater understanding, that of metabolic balance, this idea of homeostatic balance within the biological system. In addition, they introduced the whole aspect of balance of the health of mind and soul, a very important part which we rediscovered with psychology today. This whole idea of keeping stress and anxiety in check. They understood this way back in the Greek classical period. However, at a large scale, we can say that the most significant vectors that have influenced human health have been famines, malnutrition, and plagues. Indeed, it's very clear that famines have frequently affected different societies. Chinese, for example, have been affected from 100 BC to about 1910 AD by a total of 1,800 famines. The British Isles, 200 famines. Europe from 1308 to 1332, just prior to the major plagues, several famines swept through Europe during that particular time. We also have malnutrition resulting in the 18th century from the agricultural revolution. More output was required from agricultural facilities and farms and so forth to feed greater population. Therefore, greater prices were coming up, and we saw a shift from subsistent small farms to large commercial farms focused on single crops. Certainly, the famous French Paris famine of 1709 illustrates this 18th century phenomena. Consequently, persistent low starvation for about 40% of Europeans became a reality, where we saw landless and jobless workers roaming the European countryside looking for work. So as a result, there's frequent low-grade famines that are devastating France roughly around 1789, and between 1792 and 1795 caused an overt physical manifestation of diseases as a result of this. So the immune system of the Europeans were weakened and they became devastated by disease. By the 19th century, we see the Industrial Revolution kick in, and here we start to see people migrating in great numbers from rural areas where the impact of the agricultural revolution had been felt, and there were a lot of jobless workers, a lot of migrant farm workers that were looking for jobs, and they basically start to migrate towards the urban centers in search of the higher paying factory jobs. The urbanites, unlike the rural dwellers, started to experience outbreaks of scurvy. Why did this happen? Well, they had depleted the reserves of cabbage and leeks and onions, which are all high in vitamin C, over the winter. Again, remember, in the cities there was no storage facilities, grocery stores were not there. This whole migration towards the cities was a new phenomena. This left a diet that was limited only to meat and bread until the spring. So consequently, by the spring, scurvy started to break out. So what took place was very interesting. Food production changed dramatically to an industrial scale production to accommodate the large population base now conglomerating in the cities. The urbanization process made acquiring and consuming all manners of food like milk and apples and meats and so forth, an anxiety-provoking process. So this was because the mothers that were going out to purchase food for the family were bringing foods that had been putrefied and affected by bad hygiene, and so consequently making family members sick. So it was an anxiety-provoking process. Consequently, during that time, the incentive, especially between 1870 and 1930, was very high to develop a very, very workable canning industry that could sort of bring this secure food that the people were looking for. The American household was also being transformed. Looking specifically at the 19th century early on, we could see that 85% of manufactured goods were generated directly from the household in 1800, and by 1830 we could see that the family had basically become more of a purchasing unit rather than a manufacturing unit. The dramatic decline in household self-sufficiency within a generation translated into a more commercial dependency on food. In other words, the household was basically going out of the home to basically purchase or acquire the foods it needed rather than grow it. In fact, the number of commercial bakeries increased 700%, causing homemade bread to drop from 80% to a mere 6% of all bread produced in the United States by 1920. So malnutrition was beginning to pepper the United States, as well as a lot of the consequences of food impurity. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the USDA food economists devised a new food guide consisting of 12 food groups, and they were recommending a liberal consumption of bread. And this liberal consumption of bread, while wise if bread is in fact quite healthy, wouldn't have been so bad, but in the wake of the mechanization of milling and the production of poor quality flour, this created a disaster. Malnutrition became prominent around the United States because of the love affair of Americans with white bread, and 50% of the calories from American adults was coming from actually white bread. The white flour was so heavily processed, starting in the early parts of the 20th century with mechanized milling, the bleaching process, and so forth, that there were very few, if any, nutrients present in flour. Add to that the fact that the bleaching process, initially introduced with nitrogen trichloride and then banned by the FDA, got adapted with another bleaching agent called chlorine dioxide. Even the U.S. Army recruits were actually quite malnourished. So what ends up happening, of course, here is quite a disturbing effect of processing affecting the American public at all aspects, at all levels. In addition to all of this, the meatpacking industry was deplorably controlled. The Jungle, the book published by Upton Sinclair, showed how the packing industry was actually completely out of control and very with a very high prevalence of unsanitary practices, consequently leading to poor quality meat distribution within the United States. So this book single-handedly caused the American public to want a pure food, and indeed the Pure Food Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 got instituted in Congress because of this outcry, which the book was able to produce. It was clear that during the Great Depression of 1929, the dietary quality of Americans was seriously compromised. In fact, an assessment by the government using key home economists and dietitians looked at key foods such as milk, butter, tomatoes, citrus fruits, and they concluded that in order for the American people to increase their diet to the standard of a good diet, they needed to achieve the following: 20% more milk, 15% more butter, 35% increase in egg consumption, 70% more tomatoes and citrus fruit, and 100% increase in vegetables. These were all the products that were being rationed and that were limited to the population at the time. It's very clear that in addition to malnutrition and the great famines, that the plagues played a clear and significant role in disease process and in wiping out large fragments of the human population. There really are two noteworthy plagues to pay attention to: the bubonic and pneumonic plagues that swept through Europe during the 14th century, and all through the Middle Ages right up until the early parts of the 18th century. Then the second was the 19th century cholera plague that affected Europe. Noteworthy were France and England, before it came over into the Americas as well. Now, what's interesting about the cholera epidemic is that it wasn't really specifically medical interventions that contained the epidemic, because the antibiotics had not yet been devised, but it was really public health measures taken by Edwin Chadwick in the late 19th, early 20th century. Most notably, the most influential was the actual national system of sewers and waterways that were modernized in London, and the same technology then moved over into the United States. So then historians conclude quite accurately that the cholera epidemic ended both because of a dramatic improvement in public hygiene and because of the lower classes' greater purchasing power that gave them access to better food and better living conditions. In this next section of Chapter 1, I'm going to focus on the rise in chronic diseases. The cumulative impact of these chronic diseases were so significant in the United States that between 1980 and 2017, we saw total health expenditure grow from $256 billion a year to $3.5 trillion. In 2010, slightly more than 50% of all healthcare expenditures originated from hospital care and from physician and clinical services. The CDC now estimates that about 75% of total healthcare costs are tied to chronic disease. The American public is so sick with chronic diseases that the strategy for prevention is not yet implementable. In fact, since the 1980s, we could say that the most significant contributor to the epidemic of chronic diseases in the United States is actually obesity. Many secondary diseases are derived from obesity: hypertension, atherosclerosis, gallbladder disease, sleep apnea, type 2 diabetes, and various cancers, including depression. But the paradox is that physicians will rarely address the obesity issue in their family practice. From a dietary management perspective, let's see what's at play. Well, since the 1970s, the diet has been a constant problem. Too much saturated fat, too much dietary cholesterol, too much total fat, and too much total sodium, all because our diet is just very heavily processed and very focused on meat consumption. In 1977, the Senate Select Committee, headed by Governor George McGovern, along with the scientific community, attempted to impose or recommend healthy ranges for carbohydrate intake. 55 to 60% had been basically established. Also, in order to maintain lower risks of heart disease and cardiovascular disease in the population, less than 30% of calories should come from fat. The data wasn't strong enough to quantify any limits for saturated fat. Dietary cholesterol should still be less than 300 milligrams. And for the very first and last time, we see the government recommending a limit on total sugar, less than 15% of calories. Salt, less than 3 grams. So what we see is the committee imposing limits on salt and sugar because of the highly processed nature of our diet. It wanted to bring us towards eating healthier foods that were less processed. But we also see meat intake getting specifically targeted in order to decrease fat and saturated fat intake. Now, the cattle ranchers of America didn't like this, and they hired hard-hitting lobbyists to basically tell the government not to impose any further limits on meat consumption. Pressures from the scientific community's recommendation to decrease meat ingestion, because the scientific data sort of suggested that there was a certain carcinogenity to high meat consumption, that was changed to decrease consumption of animal fat and choose meats, poultry, and fish, which will reduce saturated fat intake. Sort of recommendation that still, in the end, didn't harm the meat industry as seriously as it should have. The true nefarious atherogenicity of the trans fats emerged about 13 years later when Willett and his colleagues from Harvard confirmed in 1993 that trans fat did cause LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, to increase, and HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol, to drop, and markers of inflammation to increase. The 1979 food pyramid that emerged from the recommendations from the 1977 Senate Select Committee basically identified for the first time that overeating was a significant problem and pointed the finger at a culprit of different foods that needed to be consumed more sparingly. The 1979 Healthy Peoples Report concluded that it was indeed possible to lower disease rates by adopting healthy dietary practices. This Healthy People Report influenced the 1980 Dietary Guidelines for Americans that were formulated based on this report. Subsequently, every 5 years afterwards, new dietary guidelines began to emerge, notably the 1985 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Looking at the Surgeon General's 1988 report on nutrition and health, we get a clearer understanding of the health of the nation. The report promoted a dietary pattern that emphasized consumption of vegetables, fruits, whole grain product foods, rich in complex carbs and fiber, and of fish, poultry without skin, lean meats, low-fat dairy products, selected to reduce the consumption of, indeed, total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. Subsequent to the Surgeon General's report, the 1989 National Research Council's Food and Nutrition Board issued clarifications by quantifying the limits on total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. We can see here that they stay firm with the idea that that there's a better population improvement in cardiovascular risk when total fat is less than 30% of calories. And they quantify saturated fat limits at less than 10% and continue to promote cholesterol, that is dietary cholesterol, at less than 300 milligrams. The emphasis here was to consume more fruits and vegetables during this time and to increase starches and other complex carbohydrates by eating at least 6 servings per day of breads and cereals, in addition to legumes, which are, chickpeas and soybean and lentils and fava beans and foods of that nature. In the wake of these recommendations, we see several organizations, notably the USDA, get together and create a 5-a-day fruit and vegetable campaign to incite the U.S. population to increase their fruit and vegetable consumption to a minimum of 5 per day, because it had become clear that their consumption of fruit and vegetables was very suboptimal. In 1990, dietary guidelines for Americans were put together by the Department of Health and Human Services and the USDA. They advocated here for 30% or less of calories to be dedicated to fats, to total fat, the importance of maintaining a healthy weight, saturated fat, again, being recognized from the Council's recommendation of less than 10% of calories, total cholesterol, again, less than 300 milligrams, and then more fruits, vegetables, and grains in the diet, and also using sugar and sodium in moderation, all basically reflections of problems in the American diet that was actually being documented by epidemiologists and nutritionists, notably the very low intake of fruits and vegetables in the diet and the heavy processing of food that was taking place and that was modifying the diet, in which there was a lot of sugar and a lot of sodium. So the focus makes a lot of sense. Bring the sugar down, bring the sodium down, because they're already too elevated. The 1992 Food Pyramid instituted these changes that were recommended by the Council. The proportionality of the pyramid really demonstrated this. At the base, for instance, we see the preponderance of foods such as grains and cereals and so forth, emphasizing that this should be the foundational base of the diet. Fruits and vegetables, an entire row, emphasizing again the role of at least 5 fruits and vegetables a day. Then we see the dairy and the meats. Now, what's not really emphasized in the meat and alternates are the legumes. We do see the nuts, but that's about all that we see. But we should have dry beans in there. That should be emphasized more visually. And then at the top, we see that fats are not considered very important. It's really part of the philosophy at the time, sort of a fear of fat. We had at the time a lot of low-fat products, low-fat, no-fat salad dressings, low-fat, no-fat spreads, and so forth. But what the pyramid did not really demonstrate is that there was a difference between fats. In this case, all fats were considered bad or of the same ilk. So consequently, improvements needed to come along, where an emphasis on better kinds of fats versus poorer types of fats. The 2005 pyramid came along to bring balance and understanding of the importance of exercise and diet in generating better health. What we see here, however, is the strips for the pyramid are not as revealing as the previous pyramid, and consequently we see the meat and alternates representing not necessarily as visually as striking of a smaller place in the pyramid as we see in the previous pyramid, right? We see here that the stripes are relatively the same with very minor changes. The limitation of this version of the pyramid is that we don't quite visually understand the importance or the preponderance of grains, vegetables, and fruit in the diet relative to the meats. This is a little bit of the influence of the cattle ranchers who had strong lobbyists in government that were really trying to find a way to carve a significant or maintain a significant place for the meats and alternates in the diet. The data sort of negatively painting meats was getting stronger, but still was not strong enough to be able to make a significant mark on the design. 5 years later, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2010 focused on key social issues. First, poverty, and second, the rising prevalence of overweight and obesity among men, women, and children. Indeed, 15% of American households at that time had been able to acquire adequate food to meet their needs on a regular basis. Rising concern about the health of Americans was also on the agenda. Poor diet, poor levels of physical activity, most importantly, contributing to the epidemic of overweight and obesity in the adult and pediatric population. By 2015, the dietary guidelines for Americans remained a little bit the same, but the message was a little more subtle. First, maintain caloric balance over time in order to sustain a healthy weight. This, intimated in the message, was achieved through diet and also through exercise. But the second focus was really nutrient-dense foods and beverages. And this was a subtle way to basically recommend staying away from processed foods and also soda pop, although the guidelines didn't outrightly condemn soft drinks. 7 key points were being advanced by the Dietary Guidelines for Americans in 2015. And the first at the top is to keep sodium intake under 2,300 milligrams. Keep the saturated fat to less than 10%, replacing it with monounsaturated and with polyunsaturated oils. The emphasis, though, should be on mono. Consume less than 300 milligrams of cholesterol. Keep the trans fats at bay, limiting foods that contain synthetic sources of trans fats. That's a lot of your baking products, hydrogenated oils, and limiting the intake of solid fats. Reduce the intake of calories from solid fats and added sugar. Limit the consumption of foods that contain refined grains, especially those grains and foods that contain solid fat, sugar, and sodium. That's really most of the processed food industry. And then alcohol for women, 1 drink per day. For men, 2 drinks per day for those who are of legal age. Now, the main message from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans in 2015 was to look at a variety of vegetables, to include dark green vegetables, dark red vegetables, and legumes, to look at a variety of proteins, not just red meat, but also fish and poultry and legumes of different types, soy products, nuts and eggs, lower fat dairy products and fortified soy beverages, fortified cereals, and so forth, and to look at increasing dietary fiber, calcium, potassium, vitamin D. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2020-2025 actually is a carryover from the 2015 ones. Concern here is basically the intake of calcium, potassium, fiber, and vitamin D. These are major concerns for the population, in addition to iron, particularly for infants. Added sugar is also recognized as being excessive in the population, needs to be less than 10% of the calories. Saturated fat also needs to be less than 10% of DRI calories. Sodium intake, because of the highly processed nature of the food that we consumed, is also very high, and so the recommendation is to have total daily sodium intake below 2,300 milligrams per day, and if you're under 14 years of age, it should even be less than that, possibly 1,500. And then, of course, alcoholic beverages need to be 2 drinks per day for men and about 1 drink per day or less for women. Pregnant women, of course, should not have any alcohol. The Healthy People 2020 guidelines overlapped Healthy Eating Guidelines 2010 and 2015. The goal of these guidelines was to encourage healthy eating, to avoid the saturated fat, to avoid the trans fats, the cholesterol, added sugar, sodium, and alcohol, and to avoid weight gain and also encourage weight loss. Now, the Healthy People Guidelines 2030 really overlap the Healthy Eating Guidelines of 2020-2025. The focus is definitely on helping people eat healthier foods, more fruits, more vegetables, more whole grains, and focus again on calcium, potassium, vitamin D, and fiber. It identifies the culprit of chronic diseases like obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and other problems as being tied to the consumption of foods high in saturated fat and added sugar. These tend to be the highly processed foods. The goals also aim to increase physical activity to reduce the risk of food insecurity and hunger in the home. This became especially relevant in light of the COVID-19 lockdowns. In searching for what is a healthy diet, we first have to take a look at what makes up an unhealthy diet. I'm going to start this discussion by beginning on page 6 of the textbook and looking at the 7 errors of the Neolithic diet, notably the higher glycemic index, the deviancy in the fatty acids consumed that we see currently in our agricultural Neolithic society, the altered macronutrient composition that would have taken place from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, but probably greatly modified after the Industrial Revolution. A decrease in micronutrient density, disruption of the acid-base balance of our food supply, and a disturbance in the sodium-potassium ratio, and finally the lower fiber intake. All right, so what is a high glycemic index food? Well, first of all, the glycemic index is a measure of the capacity of one serving of carbohydrate-based food to increase the blood sugar within a defined period of time in comparison to a pure glucose or a pure refined carbohydrate. As such, various carbohydrate foods can follow a scale of 0 to 100 based on the capacity to increase that blood sugar level. As such, a high glycemic index food would have a value between 70 and 100, whereas a more moderate glycemic index would be 55 to 69, and a low glycemic index would be less than 55. In the second column of Table 1.1, you'll find the glycemic index of a variety of foods. Now, the textbook describes 2 methods of measuring the glycemic load, which is different than the glycemic index. There's the glycemic load technique 1, and there's the glycemic load technique 2. So we're going to look at the glycemic load technique 1 first. So this first technique consists first of taking the glycemic index and multiplying it by the grams of carbohydrate listed in one serving and then dividing it by 100 grams. So for instance, a food that has a glycemic index of 74 would multiply then the number of grams on a food label for a specific food. Say, for example, the label indicates 20 grams of carbohydrate in a 130-gram serving. Well, this glycemic load then would be calculated by multiplying the glycemic index, 74, by the number of grams of carbohydrates in that one serving, 20, and then dividing it by 100, which would give you about 14.8, which could be basically rounded up to 15. The glycemic load 2 technique resembles this one, except that many argue that it's probably more realistic of the true glycemic load. So, how does the technique work? Glycemic index times the grams of carbohydrate per serving divided by the weight of one serving rather than just simply an across-the-board 100 grams. So in this case, a food that has a glycemic index of 74 would multiply the grams of carbohydrate in one serving, that's times 20. But here, rather than divide by, like I said, a flat 100 grams right across all foods, it divides the number of grams in one serving. So here, divided by 30. So in this case, we get a 49 glycemic load. Well, what does this mean? Well, if we take a product like brown rice, we could see that the glycemic load technique 1 and technique 2 resemble each other, 18 and 21. The difference really appears when we start looking at products like cornflakes, just a few rows up higher. The glycemic index 1 gives us 21, indicating that it's not that much of a glycemic load. Perhaps it's good to eat. But when we do the glycemic load calculation 2, we see that it's actually at a 70. And this is because, again, we've divided glycemic index times number of grams of carbohydrate divided by actually the weight of one serving as indicated on the label. So we get a better reflection of the carbohydrate load, or the glycemic load, if you will, of the product, and we can see that the more processed it is, the higher that load would tend to be. The second deviancy that we see in the diet is the fatty acid makeup. First of all, our total fat currently represents approximately about 40% of calories, versus what the Paleolithic diet possibly had, which was about 21%. Now, if we look at healthy eating standards, we can see that healthy eating recognizes that we can be healthy if we consume between 20 to 35% of our calories from fat. So it's very clear that we can improve our fat consumption, first by decreasing it. This is true. But the other thing that's that's in a negative is the amount of omega-6 fatty acids, the polyunsaturated vegetable oils that we're consuming. We're consuming too many of these. And when we look at it in terms of a ratio, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is much larger than what it should be if we base it on 19th century and very early 20th century dietary makeups. The overall macronutrient makeup is quite different when we look at protein and carbohydrates specifically. So we see a decline, should we say, in protein intake from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic period. On average, 25% down to about 15%. The intake range varies quite a bit. 19 all the way to 35% of calories are coming from protein during the Paleolithic period, versus what we currently consume, 10 to 20%. The carbohydrate intake would have gone up as the population transitioned from a Paleolithic diet to a Neolithic diet. So roughly 22 to 40% of calories would have been coming from carbohydrates during the Paleolithic period, and as we transitioned over to a Neolithic, we're looking at 45 to 65%, which we consume today. The intake range varied quite significantly depending on who's making the argument, but to give the argument's justification, we can say that many argue that the Paleolithic period carbohydrates were actually a lot higher than what some archaeologists or archaeobotanists would have suggested, as high as 44 to 64%. And this, again, as previously mentioned, because of the number of berries and wild berries and plants that they were consuming. As you can see on this slide, the fat intake varied quite significantly, 25 to 59% of calories on the paleo diet, and this would have depended on the amount of meat consumed, which varied depending on the success of the kill or the success of the hunt. It would have depended on seasons and so forth. So the micronutrient density of our diet would have been greatly compromised because of the total amount of sugar that we're actually taking in, currently representing about 36.2% of calories, and this in the aftermath, of course, of the Industrial Revolution and also the infiltration of sugar into the diet during the 18th and 17th century. So from 1992 to 1994, about 50% of Americans were not able to meet their RDAs for a great variety of nutrients. And what the NIH's own data basically shows is that when the number of calories coming from sugar exceeds 20%, there is a significant decline in the quality of nutrition as measured by key nutrients. So what is understood by nutrient density? Well, it's the milligrams of nutrient per individual calorie. For example, 300 milligrams of calcium in 1 cup of milk, which contains about 125 calories. The nutrient density of this particular product is the amount of calcium, 300 milligrams, divided by the total number of calories in that one serving, 125 calories. So what we get for nutrient density is 2.4 milligrams of calcium per calorie. This is what we call nutrient density. Now, by comparison, caloric density is a little different. It's the number of calories per gram of food. So, for instance, one medium donut weighing 42 grams has 195 calories. Well, the caloric density of the donut is 195 calories divided by its weight. So what we're getting is 4.64 calories per gram. Well, why don't you contrast that with an apple? 182 grams. There are 94 calories. The caloric density, 94 calories divided by 182 grams, and what do we get? 0.52 calories per gram. So we can see that the natural foods have very few calories per singular individually measured weight of a gram, but that the processed foods have a much higher caloric density, so many more calories per singular gram of product. The other unhealthy feature about our diet is the acid-base balance. It has been disrupted. What we have are, first of all, acid-yielding foods and base-yielding foods. So the acid-yielding foods are the dairies, the meats, the cereals, grains, and salt. And this would theoretically, notably the acid-yielding foods, too much dairy, too much meat, and too many cereal products and salt, of course sodium being part of salt, would have generated a low-grade metabolic acidosis. So what's generally recommended is balance all this off with base-yielding foods. Fruits, vegetables, tubers, and nuts. So when we have a good distribution of our diet that balances off these things, we avoid low-grade metabolic acidosis getting produced in the body. So this is certainly an argument against going back to the misunderstood concept of the paleo diet, which many think means eating more meat. There's nothing in our current understanding of health, and there's nothing really from an archaeobotanist point of view that appears to indicate that they were eating obnoxiously great amounts of meat during that period of time. What we tend to believe, and it appears to be true, is that fruits, vegetables, tubers, and nuts need to be more prominent in our diet and balanced with an adequate amount of cereals and grains, and yes, dairy indeed, and with some meats, but not excessive meats. So what we know about the sodium-potassium ratio is that when there's an upward shift of this ratio, that means more sodium relative to potassium, there's an increase in hypertension, there's an increase in the population level of cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, and intestinal cancers. When is it that we see the sodium-potassium ratio rise? Very simply, when there's an abundance of processed foods coming into the diet. And finally, the next and final deviance in our diet is the overall lower intake of fiber because of the processing. So the hunter-gatherer would have consumed approximately 42 grams per day in fiber. Our current mean intake of fiber is about 15 grams per day, and the RDA will vary depending on what organization, but it goes between 25 to 40 grams per day. So what this tells us is that we need, as a modern society, to up our game on fiber intake, and the best way to do that is to eat more whole grains, more fruit and vegetables, for sure, but one surefire way is to include a high fiber cereal in the morning in order to meet our daily requirement. So in 2011, a new concept came out, used as a teaching tool for the population. It's the 2011 My Plate Food Guide, and it can be found at choosemyplate.gov. This particular food guide moved away completely from the pyramid concept to introduce a plate, something more familiar, perhaps many have argued, that is a more teachable instrument. Looking at the plate, the main message that we get is 3/4 of our plate need to be fruit, vegetables, and grains, with 1/4 of the plate representing protein. The other notable visual that comes out is we no longer call that purple segment meat and alternates, but rather protein. And this is because the scientific data on meat intake was very conclusive and persuasive. The higher the meat intake, the larger or the more or the greater the rise in prominence of disease. And so the idea was that meat needed to still be included in the diet, but we don't really push meat, we push the proteins. And it's the proteins that can be grain, it could be egg, it can be meats of various types, the red meats, the white meats, the legumes, and so forth. As long as they're protein, they will influence or impact our diet positively. So now I want to take a closer look at the food group choices of the My Plate Food Guide. So now if you go to page 30 in your textbook, it shows you basically how to access the choosemyplate.gov food guide. And I want you to become familiar with what 1 serving or 1 ounce equivalent is for the various food groups. I'm going to give you some examples here on this basic movie clip, but I need you to go back to the website and actually practice understanding what 1 serving or 1 ounce equivalent is for the various foods. And this is, of course, very important for any healthcare professional that's dealing with food to understand how to assess a patient's dietary intake at the first level, which is taking into account what they're consuming and being able to organize it and say you are meeting your requirements for fruit, for vegetables, for grains, for protein, for dairy, right? That's the first level of assessment. And this is what this particular segment is for, is to increase your confidence and also your skill level in assessing an individual's diet. So overall, the guide is essentially providing recommendations that meet the needs of most individuals, and the caloric range is roughly 16 to 2400 calories per day. So we're looking at 1.5 to 2 cup equivalent of fruit per day, 2 to 3 cups of vegetable equivalent per day, and the focus on dark green, orange, starchy legumes as well. Consume at least 50% of all grains as whole grains. So choose foods of high nutrient density. Go back and review what nutrient density is and control those foods that have high caloric density. Again, go back and restudy and review what these two concepts are and how they're actually calculated. Okay, the first group that we're looking at are breads and cereals, and we're going to be looking at the equivalent of 1 ounce equivalent of breads and cereals. You can do the same by going on to the choosemyplate.gov website, follow the instructions that are written out in your textbook and how to get to these particular sites or specific locations on the website. But this is what we have. 1 ounce equivalent of bread and cereal is a 1/2 cup of cooked rice. It's a 1/2 cup of macaroni, spaghetti, or pasta. It's a slice of bread, 1 mini bagel or a 1/2 of a medium-sized bagel, a cup of cold cereal like cornflakes, or 1 1/4 cup if you're using puffed, 1/2 cup of cooked cereal if you're using oatmeal or cream of wheat, 1 medium or 2 small pancakes, and 3 cups of popcorn. There are other examples on the website, and I invite you to go and check them out. So if the patient you're assessing says, I had a cup of rice for lunch, you can basically say, oh, you've had 2 ounce equivalent of bread and cereal with that particular cup of rice. If your patient says, I've had 2 sandwiches, that would basically mean 4 ounce equivalent of bread and cereals, because 1 slice of bread is 1 ounce equivalent. Now let's look at the vegetable group. Well, one cup equivalent is 1 cup of vegetables, frozen, canned, or fresh. A half a cup of tomato sauce because it's a little more concentrated. 2 cups of leafy raw vegetables like spinach or lettuce. That's because it's less dense. 1 cup of vegetable juice like a V8. 1 cup of cooked legumes like pinto beans, black beans, and kidney beans. And here you've got to be careful because the beans, legumes specifically, can count as a vegetable, but they also count as a protein. And I want you to take very clear note of what one equivalent is for legumes when they're counted as a protein. 1 large corn on the cob, 1 cup of corn, 1 medium boiled or baked potato, and 1 cup of mashed potato. So you can see it's pretty straightforward. The principles are very similar. It's 1 cup basically, as a general rule, is equivalent. 1 cup equivalent of a vegetable. And then there are modifiers there, which are very logical. So if your patient says, I've had 2 cups of lettuce for a salad, or that would be the equivalent of 1 vegetable equivalent. But if they had 4 cups because they're having a larger salad, that would be 2 cups equivalent. Similarly, if the patient is describing what they had for their meal and they said, well, I had a cup of mashed potatoes and I had a cup of corn and I had a cup of frozen vegetables, that would be the equivalent of 3 cup equivalent of vegetables. Now for protein foods, well, we talk about an ounce equivalent of meat, poultry, fish, eggs, or beans. So let's take a look. Here's what I wanted you to pay attention to. So 1 cup, if you remember, of legumes counts as 1 cup equivalent for vegetables, but a 1/4 cup of cooked legumes is really 1 ounce equivalent of protein. Here again, so that's a 1/4 cup of legumes. So if a patient says, I've had a cup of fava beans for supper, that really is 4 ounce equivalent. 1 ounce for tofu, half an ounce of nuts or seeds, 1 egg, and of course the easy one is 1 ounce of cooked meat, poultry, or fish is 1 ounce equivalent, and a tablespoon of peanut butter is 1 ounce equivalent. So if a patient said, for breakfast I put 2 tablespoons roughly of peanut butter on my bread, I had 1 egg, you can say that that was the equivalent of 3 ounce equivalent of protein. Okay, now let's take a look at the fruit group. Here we're talking about a 1 cup fruit equivalent, and what is that? Well, it's a cup of juice. It's a cup of frozen or fresh fruit. Pretty simple. 1 cup, 1 cup equivalent. 1 large banana or orange is a cup equivalent. 1 small apple is a cup equivalent, and a half a cup of dried fruit, dates, raisins. This is because they're more concentrated. That represents a cup equivalent of fruit. So if a patient has a cup of orange juice in the morning and then has a cup of fresh fruit along with some yogurt, and then has a large banana, you could say that that patient has consumed 3 cup equivalent of fruit. Go on to the website again and look over the variety of other possible foods that are being recommended by the myplate.gov website. So here's a question. How many meat and alternate ounce equivalents are found in 1 cup of beans, 3 ounces of meat, and 2 tablespoons of peanut butter? So remember, a 1/4 cup of beans is equal to 1 ounce equivalent. So we have 1 cup, that's 4 ounce equivalents of meat or protein. 3 ounces of meat, that's 1 ounce equivalent of protein for 1 ounce of meat. So 3 ounces would mean 3. So 3 added to the 4, that's 7. And then we have 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, remembering that 1 tablespoon is 1 ounce equivalent. So the answer is we have is D, 9 ounce equivalent of protein. So I encourage you to practice more with the guide by going to the choosemyplate.gov, follow the instructions in the textbook of how to get there, and review the various foods in the various food groups and the servings, and try to become very efficient and proficient at looking at the number of foods and how many ounce equivalent or cup equivalent that a patient perhaps might be consuming. So practice just as we did here. A patient has a cup of cereal, has 2 cups of rice, and then come from and using that derive the number of ounce equivalent of breads and cereal, for instance, that the patient would have consumed. So this is something that you need to become very proficient at, and I will quiz you on this with the rapid response quiz to make sure that you're properly prepared and that you have a successful concept check 1. So up next are a set of practice questions on the My Plate Food Guide that will help you better prepare for the rapid response quiz. In this first question, you could say while taking a 24-hour recall, a patient admits to eating the following over one day: 1 cup of bran flakes, 2 whole wheat toasts, 2 cups of rice for lunch, and 3 cups of spaghetti for dinner. Identify the total number of ounce equivalent of bread and cereal. So let's start counting. 1 cup of bran flakes is 1, 2 whole wheat toasts is 2, so that's 3 together. 2 cups of rice, that's the equivalent of 4, so we have 7 ounce equivalent. 3 cups of rice, that's 6, so 7 and 6, 13 ounce equivalent. Next question. A patient admits that over the last 24 hours, he consumed 1 scrambled egg, a half cup of Romano beans, 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, 3 ounces of sirloin steak, and 2 ounces of fish. Determine the total ounce equivalent of protein foods. So let's do the counting. So the first is 1 scrambled egg. So that's 1 ounce equivalent of protein. A half a cup of Romano beans is basically 2, right? 1/4 cup is 1 equivalent. So a half a cup is 2 1/4 cups. So now we have 3 ounce equivalents. 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, that's adding on 2 more, so that's 5. And then we have 3 ounces of sirloin steak, that's 8. And then we have 2 ounces of fish, that's 2 more added on to the 8. And the answer is 10 ounce equivalent. Next question. A patient admits to consuming the following over a 24-hour period: 2 cups of mixed vegetables, frozen more than likely, or fresh, 1 cup of V8 juice, 1 cup of carrots, 2 cups of raw spinach, 1 cup of cooked navy beans, and 2 cups of mashed sweet potatoes. Identify the total number of vegetable cup equivalent. Right, let's start counting. 2 cups of mixed vegetables, so 1 cup of vegetables is 1 cup equivalent. So we have 2 cup equivalents. 1 cup of V8 juice, that's another, so that's 3 cup equivalents. 1 cup of carrots, that's another, so that's 4. 2 cups of raw spinach, so 2 cups of raw spinach, that's 1 equivalent, so that's 5. 1 cup of cooked navy beans, so that's basically 1, so we've got 6. And 2 cup of mashed sweet potatoes, so 1 cup of mashed potatoes is 1, so we add on to that, that's 8 cup equivalents. In this question, if you assess during a 24-hour recall that a patient ate the following: 2 cups of Raisin Bran cereal, a half a cup of raisins, 1 large banana, 2 whole wheat toasts, how many fruit and cereal servings equivalent did they consume over breakfast? Well, the answer would likely be A, 2 fruit equivalent. Indeed, a half a cup of raisins is 1, 1 large banana is 1, so that's your 2 fruit equivalent. And then 4 ounce equivalent of breads. 1 cup of bran cereal is 1 serving, so you have 2 there, and you have 2 whole wheat toasts. That's a total of 4 ounce equivalent of bread and cereal. Finally, the last question: if a patient admits to eating over one day 1 cup of orange juice, 2 cups of fruit cup, 2 small apples, and 1 large banana, identify the total fruit cup equivalent. Well, let's begin. 1 cup of orange juice is 1, 2 cups of fruit is 2, so that's 3 together. 2 small apples, that's 5, and 1 large banana, that's 6. So that's 6 cup equivalent. All right, so what is next? So first, practice the food guide, the choosemyplate.gov. Go in and increase your proficiency following the same sort of questions that we did previously and become very, very good at it. This is very much needed in order to successfully pass the rapid response quiz number 1. Memorize the adult macronutrient ranges for food that is needed for good health, that is found in table 1.2 in your textbook. You should be able to understand also what the requirements are for saturated fat and for polyunsaturated fat. And then third, read the chapters twice, or the chapter twice, so that you may integrate a comprehensive narrative of nutrition in human health. And what this means is that you should be able, on your own, to tell a little bit of the story of the history, the historical background behind malnutrition in the United States, chronic disease in the United States. Now I want to start Chapter 2 on key concepts and calculations. It's important that students persist right to the end of this chapter in order to gain a mastery in the key calculations they'll be showing you, but also in the nutrition concepts. This slide will provide you with the key goals that you want to achieve in this chapter. First, know the metric system COL. Practice it back and forth. Second, memorize the Mifflin equation. It's too simple not to memorize. Memorize male and female equations and practice completing the Mifflin equation in about 40 seconds flat. If you're able to do that, you'll do really well in all the rest of the quizzes in this course. Create a cheat sheet for the Gary equation and then practice it. Not writing out the equation extensively, but visualizing it from your cheat sheet, and practice putting in the values as indicated by your cheat sheet, and practice getting that job done in about 75 seconds. If you're able to do these two, Mifflin and Gary equation, and practice it to that extent, you will do really well. B+, A-, and A in this class. Next, memorize the healthy ranges for protein, for carbohydrate, and for fat, and know and memorize, of course, the cutoffs for total sugar, for added sugar, for polyunsaturated fat, monounsaturated fat, saturated fat, and for sodium. So these are all in the chapters as well as in this particular lecture, so I ask you to concentrate on those. These are critical cutoffs that you should retain for the entirety of the semester. Here's a slide that will help you sort of remember what are the key metric conversions that you need to know. Well, for this class, really 1 gram, 1,000 milligrams, 1 pound, 454 grams, 1 pound would also be 0.454 kilograms, 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds, and 1 kilogram, 1,000 grams, and finally 1 inch equals 2.54 centimeters. These will, in particular, the height, 1 inch, 2.54 centimeters, the 1 pound equals 454 grams or 0.454 kilograms, are the ones that we're going to use most extensively when we actually assess metabolic energy requirements of individuals, because we use equations that call on the metric system. So we're going to have to convert pounds in weight into kilograms, height in inches into centimeters, as well as into meters. So consequently, 1 inch equals 2.54 centimeters also means 1 inch is equal to 0.0254 meters. Memorize these cold and practice using them efficiently. Now, the first concept that I want to look at is the fact that chronic disease represents a heavy price tag in the United States. 2008 statistics tagged chronic disease, or the management of it, at $147 billion per year. So there's currently belief that dietary and lifestyle modifications can help minimize the impact of chronic disease in American society and, in fact, around the world.
The consequence of this chronic disease, viewed at a population level, is that the high prevalence of diseases like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes translate into astronomical healthcare costs over the life of a patient. It also translates into greater morbidity, disability, and mortality in the population.
NIH data clearly supports that chronic disease is indeed costly at a financial level, certainly, but in terms of human life as well. Um, Deaths resulting from the diseases of the heart are the most prevalent in the population, and coming up very closely in second position is cancer, and then third, stroke. Then we see the others drop: chronic respiratory diseases, unintended injuries, and so forth. But the top three: heart disease, cancer, and stroke, most significant causes of death in the US population. The second concept is that the most significant contributor to secondary diseases in the United States is obesity. It's responsible for cardiovascular disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, currently representing about 8% of adults, and in 2050 expected to grow to about 33% of adult Americans. We see sleep apnea, gastrointestinal diseases, diverticulosis, gallbladder disease. We see degenerative disorders like arthritis and asthma, and we see the prevalence of some cancers.
In fact, more than 75% of the trillions of healthcare costs went towards the management of chronic disease in 2005.
Nutrition comes into play at different levels and different intensities. There are diseases in which nutrition plays some kind of a role: osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, and some cancers as well. But there are diseases with strong nutritional components, very heavily associated: type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, and obesity, very, very highly correlated with nutrition. And then there are specific nutrition diseases, which we'll see later in the textbook, but suffice to say that diseases like pellagra, scurvy, iron deficiency anemia, other vitamins and mineral deficiencies become quite prevalent, and nutrient toxicities as well become relevant to nutrition, especially when we talk about supplementation or maybe exaggerated supplementation. Now, the link between obesity and cancer is actually surprisingly quite elevated. 14 to 20% of all cancer deaths are apparently tied to being overweight and obese, and up to 33% of cancer deaths linked to some kind of a nutritional link. When we put lifestyle in there, we find that 59% of cancer deaths in women, and specifically 45% of cancer deaths in men, are tagged to diet and lifestyle combined together. One of the ways the government achieves or attempts to achieve a modification in disease rates in the population is to formulate or devise the dietary guidelines for Americans. And they're formulated every 5 years by the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and by the Department of Health and Human Services. And really the goal is to identify the key dietary as well as lifestyle issues that need to be addressed for the population disease reduction to take place. And these guidelines really represent a practical, hands-on way of achieving part of the healthy people's goals. Now I want to explore what I mean by nutrients. Well, nutrients are macronutrients, micronutrients, and water. All of these are considered nutrients in a global sense. Now, the macronutrients are the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fat, and you can see that they are the energy sources of the diet, right? We get calories from the carbs, the proteins, and the fat. Micronutrients, on the other hand, are not energy providing, but they certainly are vital for the proper functioning of the biological system. And we have, within micronutrients, we have vitamins, we have macro minerals, which are large quantity, fairly large quantities of minerals in the body, and we have micro minerals, usually required in microgram amount, and the macro minerals are usually in milligram amount, and we have water considered as a nutrient as well. So this slide illustrates what we actually mean by nutrients. Okay, so this is a concept that needs to be known cold. It means that you need to memorize these values so that you can do the appropriate calculations quite efficiently. Now, when we talk about energy coming from carbohydrates, we really mean 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate. So 1 gram of carbohydrate equals 4 kilocalories. 1 gram of protein equals 4 kilocalories. 1 gram of fat, 9 kilocalories. And 1 gram of alcohol, 7 kilocalories. So calories only come from the macronutrients and from alcohol. So here's some calculations that we can do with this information. So for example, if I say that a patient's had a slice of bread, you want to derive how many calories are coming from that. Well, the carbohydrates in the slice of bread is 15 grams. The amount of protein in that slice of bread is 3 grams, and the amount of fat is 0.5. So we can say in all that that one slice of bread contains 76.5 calories. How do we determine that? Well, 15 grams of carbohydrate means that there are, if we consider 4 calories for every gram, it means that there are 60 carbohydrate calories in that bread. Since protein has 4 calories per gram and there are 3 grams of protein, 3 grams times 4, 12 kilocalories. And since 1 gram of fat has 9 calories and there are 0.5 grams, 0.5 times 9, 4.5. So when we add them all up, 60 plus 12 plus 4.5, we get 76.5 calories. The Institute of Medicine has established acceptable macronutrient range distributions that are consistent with healthy living after much scientific research. Essentially, the ranges that we have here are the ones that we currently support in the United States, and they appear to be consistent if followed, to lower incidences of disease. Carbohydrate intake should be between 45 to 65% of DRI calories, but here the idea is really a prominence of complex starches and whole grains that should be in the diet. The protein should be between 10 to 35% of calories. 35% is very high. It's much higher than what the WHO recommends. WHO recommends no higher than 15% of DRI calories, but here in the United States, because of extreme sports and the lifestyles that we lead in terms of exercise, strengthening exercises and so forth, the calorie or the percent of calories for protein appears to go higher. But the most accurate method, especially the one used in healthcare, appears to be more tied with body weight than with percent calories. So we're going to be really talking about the physiological requirement based on body burden of protein. And here, the physiological requirement at baseline is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. These values go a little bit higher, and we'll talk about them later on. Fat levels should be between 20 to 35% of DRI calories, and again, the higher levels of 35%, much higher than the 1977 guidelines of 30%, is consistent with the higher level of exercise and energy expenditure that we see in extreme sports and marathon running. So a dietitian is best equipped to guide an individual in these higher levels of fat, ensuring that the fats in questions are of good quality. I want to discuss now the value and the significance of dietary carbohydrates found in section 2.1.2 in your textbook. In discussing the subject of carbohydrates, we can start off by simply outlining the general organization of carbohydrates. We think of carbohydrates then as simple sugars. We can think of them as starches. We can think of them also as fiber. And so we're going to look first at what we understand to be starches. Starches are really polysaccharides, or in other words, complex carbohydrates. Starches are important because when we look at the carbohydrate intake in North America, it's estimated that 60% of those carbohydrates are starches, whereas really 30% come from sucrose, and about 10%. There are essentially two types of starches, amylose and amylopectin. Foods that are high in amylose tend to be starchy fruits like banana and vegetables like parsnips, maybe beans, legumes including soybeans, kidney beans, navy beans, and lentils. These all tend to be high in amylose. By contrast, starches that are elevated in amylopectin tend to be potatoes, rice, and wheat. Structurally speaking, amylose is made up of a straight line structure of glucose molecules that are essentially linked together by alpha 1,4 glucosidic bonds, which are digestible by the amylase enzyme. The amylopectin structure tends to be more branched than straight line. So it's a complex molecules of side chains that are linked together by alpha 1,4, just like the amylose, but in addition, the branches are alpha 1,6. The enzyme that digests these large molecules produce essentially monosaccharides and disaccharides, which eventually get absorbed by the enterocytes of the GI tract. Because of the extensive branching of the amylopectin, there is a greater and easier access to the digestive enzymes, leading to a faster release of glucose molecules into the enterocyte and therefore into the bloodstream. So the amylopectin foods tend to have a higher glycemic index than we would see with the strictly amylose starches, which have a tighter sort of structural build, given that the branching is not there. So it's really strictly the alpha 1,4 enzymes tightly bound together. So it's more difficult for the enzymes to get in there for the amylose molecule, but again, the branching for the amylopectin allows a much easier access of the digestive enzyme, quicker release of glucose. Next, I want to examine fibers and specifically what role they play in our diet. So one way of defining a fiber is an undigestible carbohydrate. We can see here structurally that fibers are, especially in the form of cellulose, a series of glucose molecules linked together, but by a beta 1,4 glucosidic link, which is undigestible, which means basically no gastrointestinal enzymes can hydrolyze these links. We can classify fibers as either soluble fiber or as insoluble fiber. Let's take a closer look at what these definitions mean. So soluble fibers consist mostly of what we call gums, mucilage, pectins, psyllium, found in fruits and legumes and seeds, and also in some vegetables. Soluble fibers are also viscous fibers, which means that they have a tendency to ferment in the GI tract as they mix with the bacteria in the GI tract. The action of these viscous fibers is primarily noticeable at the level of blood cholesterol. So the fibers, because they are binding to water, they also bind bile and consequently have an effect in lowering blood cholesterol. They also have a slow glucose absorption that results from these fibers. So the more soluble fibers, the slower the glucose absorption. This tends to be beneficial for diabetes. And of course, the lowering of the cholesterol tends to be beneficial for heart disease. There's also a slow transit of food through the upper GI tract with soluble fibers. It holds on to the moisture in the stool because it's water soluble, and consequently has an effect of softening the stool. And we'll see later on how that influences um, the GI tract in a very positive way by decreasing the risk of diverticulosis. So soft stool in the GI tract really decreases what we call intraluminal pressure within the GI tract. So the takeaway message from viscous or soluble fibers is that they're soluble and also more fermentable in the GI tract. And this means that they'll produce gases, short chain fatty acids, for example, that give energy to the GI tract. There's some benefit in terms of influencing the makeup of the microbiota of the GI tract. And also, these viscous fibers have a tendency to soften the stool. By contrast, insoluble fibers do not absorb water. They do not form colloidal masses like the soluble fibers. And we find these insoluble fibers in cellulose and lignin, in psyllium, and many of the hemicellulose found in whole grains, legumes, fruits, and vegetables as well. The insoluble fibers, or what we call the non-viscous fibers, tend to be non-fermentable, and they tend to be associated with that whole grain diet that we talk about is very important for good health. So notably, we see a lot of non-viscous fibers in brown rice, in wheat bran and in whole grains. So when you get a high fiber cereal like a raisin bran cereal, it's essentially high in bran, or in other words, a non-viscous fiber. Now, this fiber tends to increase the fecal weight and the speed, consequently, of fecal passage through the colon. It does this in two ways: by increasing the um, weight. It also becomes susceptible to the gravitational pull, so it's going to move through the GI tract faster. And this insoluble fiber actually has a drawing effect of water, which causes a flushing of water through the GI tract. A flushing of water, by the way, that isn't absorbed by this fiber because it's a non-soluble fiber. So it also provides a certain feeling of fullness as well. So consequently, it alleviates constipation because it reduces the time it takes for the fecal material to go through the colon. It lowers the risk of diverticulosis, of hemorrhoids, appendicitis, and it also, because of the feeling of fullness, may help in weight management. So this means that if you're going to increase the fiber in your diet, you should eat first whole grain breakfast cereals that contain at least more than 5 grams of fiber per serving. You'll get that with a lot of the high fiber cereals like Total Raisin Bran and a lot of the Kellogg's high fiber cereals. Eating raw and cooked vegetables is also an excellent way. Fruits and vegetables with their skin, pears, potatoes, apples. And adding legumes to soups, to salads, and to casseroles are just a fabulous way to increase fiber intake, as well as a broad assortment of different nutrients. And of course, eating fresh and dry fruit for snack is an excellent way of increasing the fiber intake as well. Dietary fiber recommendations vary depending on the different organizations, but in general, we could say that the guidelines vary between 20 to 40 grams of dietary fiber per day. Now, the minimum recommended by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, in addition to the National Cancer Institute, is 20 grams per day. So that's the least that you can have. Alternatively, the Institute of Medicine recommends grams per thousand, kilocalories per day. So the recommendation is 11.5 to 14 grams per thousand calories. So this is kind of a really important recommendation because it means that the gram intake of fiber will increase as the caloric intake increases. So a 2,000 calorie diet will essentially require that you bring in 28 grams of fiber per day, for instance. The range, according to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, that is acceptable is 20 to 35 grams. This is what they generally recommend. For families that have cancer, for instance, the recommendation is 35 to 40. The Mayo Foundation for Medical Education and Research recommends for women 21 to 25 grams, for men 30 to 38. And in an exceptional way, people with hypercholesterolemia or high levels of blood cholesterol, the recommendation is to increase fiber to 50 grams per day with a preponderance of soluble fiber. If you want to read up more about fiber, you can also go to the Mayo Clinic webpage, and here it is right here, and you can write it right into your Internet Explorer or your Google Chrome and explore the different articles and the different recommendations that they have for fiber. After looking over the Mayo Clinic review, which among the foods below contains about 16 grams of fiber in one serving? That's really high. Is it the 1 cup of raspberries? Is it the 1 cup of whole wheat spaghetti? The 1 cup of split peas? Sunflower seeds? Is it the raisins? The answer is actually the split peas that are cooked, 1 cup, a very significant amount of fiber. And this is the message for those that want to increase their fiber intake, is to include legumes into the diet. Now I want to pay attention to sugar consumption and the role that moderate to large intakes play in the development of chronic disease. So how do we control for excessive sugar intake? Well, first we have to identify that sugar comes from, first of all, the total sugar in our diet, which is from natural sugar and from added sugar. And the NIH tells us that whenever population groups consume more than 20% of their calories from sugar, from total sugar, the quality of the nutrition goes down. So although there is no government regulation specifically restricting total sugar, we can certainly go by the guideline of aiming for less than 20% of calories. So this means a person consuming 2,500 calories a day, if you multiply that 2,500 calories by 0.20, which is 20%, then divide that amount by 4, you get 125 grams. So this would be the maximal amount of total sugar. So this would be the sugar coming from fruits and juices and milk, and it would also include the sugar that's coming from your breakfast cereals and the processed foods. So all of these combined together would be limited to 125 grams per day on a 2,500 calorie diet, but the guideline is less than 20%. The other way to do it is also to restrict the added sugar, and this the government recommends, to less than 10% of the calories. And the added sugar is really the sugar that's been added by the manufacturer. So you're looking at a lot of processed foods. Now I want to review the principles and the concepts of dietary protein. So let's begin with defining what a protein is. A protein is really an accumulation of amino acids linked together to form a protein. And where do we find proteins but in muscles and in organs? And the main sources of the protein in our diet are the meats, the fish, the poultry, the dairy products, and then we also have the beans and nuts, or the beans are also called legumes, and they include things like soybean, fava bean, romano bean, soybeans, a variety of lentils, and so forth, and the nuts. And these provide us with our basic proteins in our diet. Section 2.1.3 gives you more of the structural frame of a protein and of an amino acid, and it provides you with additional information regarding the indispensable amino acids or the necessary required amino acids, as well as the conditionally indispensable and so forth. So I encourage you to read through the chapter and to get more complete information regarding the proteins. Here's a summary of the basic requirements that you need to know about protein. First, in terms of percent of calories, the macronutrient recommended guidelines is 10 to 35% of the DRI calories, or the requirement calories. Now, in terms of specific guidelines, they are based on body weight, and we will be relying on this, especially when we get into the medical aspect of the protein needs. But we know that physiologically, the protein requirements for the body is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. So this basically means that if an individual weighs, let's say, 80 kilograms, that his amount or her amount of protein based on the body weight would be 64 grams, or 0.8 times 80 kilograms. Now, this is a basic physiological requirement. It usually is associated with roughly 10% of the DRI calories. But when it comes to the need for higher activity, the guidelines suggest anywhere between 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight will meet the needs of most individuals that are actually working out. And this usually is associated with roughly about anywhere between 10 to 15% of the DRI calories. The maximal allowance for protein is estimated at 2 grams per kilogram body weight. And that's for all healthy individuals, right, that even those that do a lot of sport, a lot of strengthening exercises, they shouldn't really be going over 2 grams per kilogram body weight. So when we calculate the protein needs, or how much protein we have in our diet, we can assume that there are 4 calories of energy for every gram of protein. And the other thing to consider is that protein is our primary source of nitrogen. And this is one of the reasons why our requirements are usually based on body weight, i.e. 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, because when we eat protein, we have to consider the burden on the body, because we need to process that protein through our kidney, and we essentially then pee it out as urea nitrogen. So protein is very different than carbohydrate or fat in that way. Essential amino acids are referred to in the textbook as indispensable amino acids. They're found on table 2.1. And indispensable amino acids means that the body absolutely requires them through the diet in order to be able to synthesize protein properly. There are, in fact, 9 essential amino acids, or indispensable amino acids, that are needed in order to synthesize protein. And these are leucine, isoleucine, valine, threonine, lysine, histidine, methionine, phenylalanine, and tryptophan. And they're all found here. Now, one of the things that nutritionists and dietitians should do is be able to memorize these. And I've created a sentence below to help in the memorization process. Lucy and Valerie, and all 3 lied about having met for a phenomenal historical trip. Now, this wacky sentence is actually easy to remember, and you'll see in the next slide how the names of the individuals and of the different events in this sentence are actually the beginnings of the different amino acids. Indeed, I've highlighted in red the beginning of each of the amino acids and the different events that are described. So LEU for leucine, isoleucine, Val for valine, 3 for threonine, Lide for lysine, Met for methionine, PHE for phenomenal, historical, right? PHE for phenylalanine, Hist for histidine, and Trip for tryptophan. So I expect students to memorize this sentence and to be able then to memorize the 9 essential amino acids. Now I'd like to talk about dietary fats, both in terms of the recommended quantity of fat based on macronutrient ranges that have been deemed reasonable and healthy for the American population, and also in terms of the quality of the fat that needs to be consumed. This can be further complemented by reading section 2.1.4 on lipids in your textbook. When we talk about fats, it's really a broad category that includes lipids, and they consist of cholesterol, saturated fat, unsaturated fat, and phospholipids. Um, for the most part, our understanding is that foods that are high in dietary cholesterol and saturated fats can increase the risk of heart disease. So we tend to cautiously try to restrict or diminish the contents of saturated fat specifically because it's the greatest and most significant culprit, whereas dietary cholesterol is not really considered as nefariously as it once did. But still, for some familial types of hypercholesterolemia, we talk to the patients about lowering their dietary cholesterol. Now, foods that are high in unsaturated fat, such as vegetable oils and olive oil, can lower the risk of heart disease. Here are a few things to remember about fats and oils. First of all, they're composed of lipids. These are molecules that are essentially insoluble in water. They contain 9 calories for every gram. In contrast, obviously, the protein at 4 calories per gram and the carbs at 4 calories per gram. They're found in butter, they're found in margarine and vegetable oils. And essentially, there's a source of fat-soluble vitamins and essential fatty acids. And these essential fatty acids means that they are essential to life, to the maintenance and the growth of the neurological system. There are a lot of details on this slide, but essentially they go over the content and comparisons between oils in terms of content of polyunsaturated oils, which we refer to here as linoleic acid. Linoleic acid is the first of the essential fatty acids, and we can see it primarily very present in sunflower seed oil, safflower seed oil, corn oil, soybean oil, cottonseed oil. So very present in these. And this linoleic acid is what we call a polyunsaturated fat. And the description of polyunsaturated fat is in the section of your textbook, which is section 2.1.4 that reviews the lipids and the structure of saturated, polyunsaturated, and monounsaturated. And so I'd like you to review those. But for now, what I'm going to do is just look at the various components here. And one additional essential fatty acid is in gray, and it's not prominently found. This is the alpha linolenic acid as opposed to linoleic. This one is called alpha linolenic acid. Let's take a look where it's found primarily. So it's significant in canola oil. It's very prominent in flaxseed oil. And then it's prominent as well in soybean oil. So these are the three main oils that contain the alpha linolenic acid. So there are two essential essential fatty acids rather: linoleic acid, which is a polyunsaturated fat, and then alpha linolenic acid, which is also a polyunsaturated fat but of a different structure. It's an omega-3 fatty acid. The linolenic acid, made up of polyunsaturated fats, is an omega-6 fatty acid. And then in black we have the monounsaturated fats, which are very common in olive oil. So you can see here that olive oil is the oil that has the most prevalent amount of monounsaturated fat. In second, we have the canola oil. And in third, we have the peanut oil. And so these are the three main vegetable sources of monounsaturated fat. We find also, very interestingly, in butterfat, a significant amount there of monounsaturated fat. And we also find it in beef tallow and in lard. And this is a very noticeable and significant content here, which we're going to discuss a little later on. But for now, it's important that the students understand the differences of the different oils. First, there are the polyunsaturated oils, rich in linoleic acid, which are omega 6s. Then there are the oils that are polyunsaturated as well, that are alpha linolenic acid in gray, and these are of the omega 3 fatty acids. Then there are the ones in black, which are the monounsaturated fats, considered very healthy, and these are of the omega 9 fatty acids. And then at the top here, we see the saturated fats, and the saturated fats are indicated in the darker gray on the far left side. And what's notable here is, as a rule, we tend to vilify the meats and the lards as being prominent sources of saturated fat, and this high saturated fat is linked to higher risks of heart disease. It's even more atherogenic than dietary cholesterol. But what we often miss is the palm oil, the butterfat, not the butterfat, sorry, the palm oil and the coconut oil, which are vegetable oils that are significantly high in saturated fat. And it's not quite clear in the literature yet whether or not the saturated fat in these oils are as atherogenic or prone to increasing the risk of heart disease as in beef tallow and lard. Certainly we see butterfat is high as well, and that's always been vilified. In fact, that's why we turned to margarines, only to discover later on that the margarines were more nefarious than the butterfat and more nefarious than the lard. The same thing for the shortenings, right? The shortenings ended up being more nefarious than the lard. And why is that? Well, that's because the margarines and the shortenings were extremely high in trans fatty acids, which were created as a byproduct when the food industry was creating these artificial fats, so to speak, or artificial butter-like or lard-like fats. Now, if you look at the composition, you'll see that the lard actually wasn't as bad as so many thought. Yes, it was high in saturated fat, but there was actually a significant amount of monounsaturated fat. So taken in moderation, this was not actually a bad choice. The same thing for butter. You can see, sure, it is high in saturated fat, but there's also a significant amount of monounsaturated fat. So taking both the lard and the butter fat, in moderation, by not over consuming baked products, for example, which is where they tend to be used, it can be part of a very healthy diet. Whereas now the margarines and the shortenings are looked at more nefariously. I encourage students to refer to Focus Box 2.1 in your textbook in the second column, Percent Dietary Standards, to memorize these standards. Now what we're specifically looking at is the cutoff for saturated fat, less than 10% of calories, polyunsaturated fat, 5 to 10%. And the reason is that while the polyunsaturated fats are providing that essential fatty acid, basically linoleic acid, and while the polyunsaturated fats of which is of course an omega-6, and while the polyunsaturated fats of the omega-3 category are providing alpha linolenic acid, these are very important. The polyunsaturated oils are essentially limited to about 10%, because there is some concern that high levels of polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acids have a tendency to become pro-oxidants. In other words, bringing higher levels of oxidative stress and microinflammation to the body. Many cardiovascular researchers are suspecting that the high level of polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acids in our diet are responsible for this microinflammation, which is actually part of the etiology of heart disease. So containing it to 5 to 10% is really meant to meet the essentiality of these fatty acids, but not to bring in so much of this omega-6 fatty acid that it becomes a pro-oxidant in our body. Now, the reverse, of course, for the omega-3s is very clear. The omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, so oils that are high in omega-3s, notably the flaxseed, notably the canola oil and the soybean, are really to be encouraged, in addition, of course, to the oils that come from certain types of fish high in omega-3s. These are protective against heart disease. Now, the other component that we should look at is also, the amount or the cutoffs for monounsaturated fat. And most agree that the literature suggests that a good healthy diet should not contain less than 11% of the calories coming from monounsaturated fat. This is in your textbook, and I ask you to review these on page 52, the Focus Box 2.1, and of course it continues to explore this on page 54. So the macronutrient range recommendations for carbohydrate, protein, and fat, in addition to the specific cutoff and ranges for the specific fats, saturated, polyunsaturated, and monounsaturated fats, these are all coming from very two distinct recommendations, the USDA My Plate Guide, and of course the healthy vegetarian and Mediterranean diets are all supportive of this type of eating. Moreover, we can see that the cutoff recommendations that we have for the fats are also very consistent with the DASH diet, which we're going to see in greater depth in the cardiovascular heart disease chapter. DASH diet is dietary approach to stop hypertension. The 2015 Dietary Guideline for Americans had key principles for long-term health. We're just going to review them here. They should be part of what you understand is important in nutrition guidance. So first, maintenance and achieving a healthy weight by making wise selections in food and beverage choices that are high in nutrient density in order to diminish the risk of chronic diseases. So this is actually a very important focus. Limit the intake, the caloric intake, and ingest nutrient-dense foods that are consistent with My Plate. So a lot of fruits and vegetables and so forth. Significantly reduce the intake of foods that are high in sugar, saturated fat, sodium, and make healthy beverage choices. In other words, really stay away from processed foods that tend to be high in the saturated fat, the sodium, and the sugar, and stay away from soda pop. Shift food and beverage choices away really from the less healthy ones towards really healthy choices, which really is a very soft way of saying embrace diets that we know are very healthy. The Mediterranean diet, also the Oriental diet, for instance. Promote healthy eating in schools, in the workplace, in community centers, in churches. So be part of that community that encourages an extension of healthy eating habits in the home, bring them into the community, and really teach the children early on to stay away from the fast food and the junk food. So a lecture on healthy eating wouldn't be complete unless we dedicate some time to understanding dietary reference intakes, or what we refer to as the DRIs. Let's begin now with the understanding of what exactly is a dietary reference intake, a DRI. Well, a DRI really encompasses the dietary reference intakes for nutrients and also for energy, and for the macronutrients that we talk about, the recommended macronutrient ranges, right, or the acceptable macronutrient range distribution. So this encompasses all of the DRIs. Now, when we look specifically, we can see that within the DRIs for nutrients, we have the estimated average requirements, the EAR. We have the recommended dietary allowance, RDA. We have adequate intakes, the AI, and we have the tolerable upper intake levels, the UL. Now let's take a look at each of these so we have a better understanding. So I've outlined here the 4 DRIs for nutrients that I just spoke about: the estimated average requirement, EAR, recommended dietary allowance, RDA, adequate intake, AI, tolerable upper intake level, UL. So we're going to take a look at all of these. It's important for students to acquire certain mastery of understanding of what these various DRIs mean and how they can be used. Before beginning, I'd like students to read over section 2.2 in the textbook that actually goes over in a summary form, but with enough detail to make it comprehensive, the different DRIs that I'm referring to here. So the first thing to remember is that the estimated average requirement represents the nutrient requirement needs of 50% of the population. This is determined scientifically by some rigorous science that measures quantitative limits and cutoffs. And then the recommended dietary allowance is determined by simply adding 2 standard deviations onto the EAR. This is nicely represented in figure 2.6 in your textbook. And it's specifically the recommended dietary allowances that are used in the assessment of individual needs when we do diet counseling or we're reviewing dietary intakes from 24-hour recalls or food records. Suffice to say that the RDAs are sufficiently well developed that they represent 97 to 98% of the nutrient requirement needs of a healthy population, in particular lifestyles and gender groups. Adequate intakes are less rigorously determined. By referring back to figure 2.6, you can see how there is variability in an AI. It's not as well determined scientifically as the EAR, from which is derived the RDA, but you can see that the AI is somewhere around the RDA, and it's a way of approximating the requirements of an individual or a population, if you will. Just based on observations and less confirmatory research than the RDA, but it approximates adequately the RDA with a great deal of variability. Read more about the AI in the textbook, page 55 in the second edition. The UL, or the tolerable upper intake level, was established in the wake of a lot of supplementation and a lot of functional foods that have a lot of supplementation in them. And so consequently, the risk of excessive intake had been noted, and there was consequently an establishment of these upper tolerable limits where if an individual exceeds that limit, the risk of toxicity increases exponentially the more they exceed that upper limit. These ULs are found right here, and they're also found at the end of chapter 3 in your textbook. And you can see that toxicity then occurs when an individual's intake increases beyond these particular cutoffs. So it can be a little misleading because an individual might be taking in 500% of their RDA, meaning that they're, exceeding their RDA by 500%. But if the quantity actually consumed of that specific nutrient doesn't exceed this particular cutoff, then the intake of that individual remains adequate. So it's very important to understand that these particular cutoffs here are meant to understand that if you exceed these cutoffs, you're increasing your risk of toxicity. But if you remain below these cutoffs, then the risk of toxicity is significantly less. And this is really independently determined from the percent RDA. Right? The percent RDA can be very misleading because these percentages can be very high, and it simply means that you're exceeding the RDA specifically, but it's not exceeding the RDA that creates toxicity. It's exceeding the UL cutoff. So good thing to remember. So what can we conclude from this? Well, that it is actually safe to eat nutrients between the RDA all the way up to the UL. The risk of toxicity is absolutely minimal. The moment that we cross the UL, we increase our risk of toxicity, and that risk increases exponentially the more we exceed the UL. Now I want to take a few moments and introduce you to the principles behind assessing a human diet. So I want to go over the principles here of what constitutes a risk of deficient nutrients. First of all, the macronutrients. When are they suboptimal? Well, consider the healthy macronutrient ranges. Carbohydrates have a healthy macronutrient range of 45 to 65% of DRI calories. And I'd like to stress DRI calories because these particular standards are not established based on what someone eats, but really based on what their requirements are. Protein 10 to 35 and fat 20 to 35. So a suboptimal intake of carbohydrates is when you're less than 45. For protein, it's when you're less than 10, and fat is when you're less than 20% of the DRI calories. Now let's take a look at the micronutrients. The probability approach developed by George Beaton from the University of Toronto explains that when the micronutrient intake of an individual is less than 66% of the RDA, it increases the risk of micronutrient deficiency. So when we talk about excesses and we come back to macronutrients, well, excesses would be when you're over 65% of energy coming from carbohydrates. So you'd be excessive in carbohydrate. You'd be excessive in protein intake if you're over 35% of the DRI calories. And you'd be excessive in fat intake if you were over 35% of the DRI calories. For micronutrients, excess, again, is only when you exceed the UL as indicated on the UL table previously, also found at the end of Chapter 3. This table illustrates how a nutrient analysis can effectively be made. First column indicates the nutrients, the second one is the RDA, the third one is the actual intake, and the fourth column is the percent of the RDA. So what we have here is the RDA for calcium is 1,000 milligrams, thiamine 1.1 milligrams, vitamin A 900 micrograms, and vitamin D 15 micrograms. So what we see in this dietary intake is that the individual is consuming 650 milligrams of in their diet, and this represents 65% of the RDA. That's 650 divided by 1,000 milligrams times 100. So the same calculations are done for the other nutrients. So thiamine represents 62% of the RDA, vitamin A 76%, and vitamin D 287%. So let's take a look at these percentages. So based on our understanding for micronutrients, the intake at 65% for calcium is deficient because it's under or at a high risk of being deficient, I should say, in the diet because it's less than 66%. The thiamine at 62% is also at high risk of being deficient in the diet at less than 66%. But the vitamin A at 76%, even though it's under the RDA, the probability model indicates that at 76%, there's a much lower risk of it being deficient. So we talk about being adequate. This adequacy, again, is anything over 66 all the way up to the UL. The vitamin D at 43 micrograms represents 287% of the RDA, and that would lead us to maybe think that this is actually an excessive amount. But if you consult the UL table at the end of Chapter 3, you'll see that 43 milligram or micrograms is still under the 50 microgram cutoff for the UL. So even though it's 287%, it's still adequate because that intake of 43 micrograms is still under the cutoff for the UL for that particular nutrient. Here's an example of how a diet can be assessed in terms of calories and micronutrients. At the top, we have the caloric intake, 2,060 calories, and we have the DRI calories, that is the calories that this person requires based on their height and their weight and their age, and that is needed for weight stability, 2,750 calories. So what we want to do here is we want to determine if the calories are low enough so that they might indicate a possibility of deficient calories in the diet. And to do that, a caloric intake that's less than 75% of the DRIs can be considered at risk of being deficient. So let's see what percent that we're at. 2060 over 2750, 74.9%. This is indeed less than 75%, so we can put D here as deficient. Now, when it comes to the micronutrients, we use a different kind of assessment approach. If the micronutrient is less than or equal to 66% of the RDA or the DRI, it's considered deficient. So let's take a look at the vitamin D. 3.4 micrograms and the DRI is 15 micrograms. Well, let's check the percent. 3.4 divided by 15 times 100, 22.67. 22.67% is indeed less than 66% of the DRI. This means that this individual runs a high risk that their dietary intake might be chronically deficient. So we put a D. Let's take a look at vitamin E. 11 milligrams is the intake. The DRI is 15. 11 over 15 times 100, 73.33%. Now, one might be prompted to say, well, the percent is indeed less than 100%, which means it's clearly under the RDA, so shouldn't it be deficient? Well, we're using the probability model of Dr. Beaton out of the University of Toronto that indicates that given the variability in intake, some days we get high intakes, other days we get low intakes, and statistically what appears to be significant is when that low intake as an average is less or equal to 66% of that DRI, it's at a high risk of deficiency. So at 73%, we could essentially say that the intake is adequate. Thiamine, 3.4 to 1.2. Here, we're consuming 283.33% of the RDA. We would be prompted to say, well, this person's intake might be excessive. But remember, the only way to determine the excessive nature of a nutrient is to look at the ULs, which were found on the slide previously and at the end of chapter 3 of your textbook. And you can see that when you look at the list of ULs, of upper tolerable limits, thiamine is nowhere to be found. Any nutrient that isn't found in that list simply means that no one has ever been able to determine a toxicity level. So this means that regardless of the percentage and regardless of the intake, 3.4, this thiamine intake can only be essentially categorized as insufficient or deficient if it's under 66% of the DRI, or it could only be assessed as adequate, but certainly it can't be assessed as excessive. Vitamin C, 1300 milligrams, 90 milligrams. Well, now we've got another example. So here, the percent looks outrageously high, 1,444% of the DRI. One would be prompted to say, oh, this has got to be excessive. But again, going back to the UL table, you'll see that the UL for vitamin C is not 1300. In fact, 1300 is well below. So this means that this nutrient can also in this case be categorized as adequate. Now I want to add one more thing in regard to excesses in terms of calories. We were able to see for deficiency that if it's less than 75% of the DRI, then it would be called deficient. But for calories to be excessive, it's got to be greater than 25% over the DRI. To make it easy, let's do one calculation, for example, just to set the record straight. So if the DRI is 2,750, we simply multiply that amount by 1.25, and that tells us that the upper cutoff for what is excessive is 3,438 calories. So if somebody's intake is greater than 3,000, or if this person's intake, I should say, is greater than 3,438, then we could say that their intake is at a high risk of being considered excessive. Another aspect of a nutrient analysis that you must know is also the macronutrients. Again, we've spoken about this earlier, but here's a reminder. What is it that you need to know cold are the recommended macronutrient ranges for carb, protein, and fat. These you must know absolutely without hesitation. In addition, you need to know the polyunsaturated range is of 5 to 10% of DRI calories. Again, the carbohydrates, it's 45 to 65% of the DRI calories. Same for the protein and the fat. Notice that I say DRI calories and not actual calories. Indeed, when you're measuring a person's standards by which you're going to compare their carbohydrate intake, you don't use what they eat, you use what they should eat. And this establishes the standard. Then you can measure what they eat and say whether or not the carbohydrates that are consumed in their diet is within this standard. But the standard that we're talking about in grams is derived from these percentages here using the DRI calories or the recommended calories. Same thing for the polyunsaturated fats. To meet the healthy standards, the polyunsaturated fat should be 5 to 10% of the DRI calories. The monounsaturated fats equal to 11 or greater, right, all the way up to 20% of the DRI calories. Saturated fat less than 10% of the DRI calories, and total sugar less than 20% of the DRI calories. So now for an example, let's look at what we would do if a person's DRI calories were 2,350 calories. So the goal then would be to change these healthy eating standards in column 2 into gram equivalencies, because essentially it would be easier then to compare the actual intakes, because the actual intakes when recorded by computer analysis will also be in grams. So it's best if you take your calculators out and follow along with the calculations. So I'll do the first one with you. Carbohydrates 45 to 65%. And so what are we looking at is 45% of 2,350 and 65% of 2,350. In that manner, we can set up the gram range of carbohydrates for healthy eating. So now if we do the multiplication, 2,350 multiplied by the lower range of 0.45 or 45%, this gives us 1,058 calories. We divide that by 4, again, because there are 4 calories for every gram of carbohydrate, and the lower range should give us 264 grams. Let's do the upper range. 0.65, because that's 65%, times 2,350. That gives us 1,528 calories. Divide that by 4, because there's 4 calories per gram, and we get an upper limit of 382 grams. You can do the same thing with protein, and you can do the same thing with fat, remembering to divide by 9. And you can do the same thing with the polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, and saturated fats, remembering that these are all fats. So when you're doing the division, it's important to divide by 9. Now, when we do sugar, sugar, of course, is a carbohydrate. So sugar has 4 calories for every gram. So this means the calculation goes as follows. 0.2, which is 20%, times 2,350, and divide that by 4, and we get 117.5 grams, which could be rounded up to 118 grams. So it's less than 118 grams per day in total sugar, which is the goal for healthy eating. Now we can actually input the actual computer analysis of the diet, and we can see that in column 3. 282 grams of carb, 130 grams of protein, 64 grams of fat, and so forth all the way down. And on the 4th column, we're going to assess whether it's adequate, suboptimal, or excessive. So A for adequate, S for suboptimal, E for excessive. So if we look at the carbohydrates, we can see it's very easy, because now we've got our standards in the 2nd column in grams, and we have our computer analysis generating our intake, our actual intake in grams. So if we look at it, we can see that at 282, we're clearly between 264 and 382, so we get an A for adequate for carbohydrates. Protein, 59 to 206 grams, and at 130 grams, clearly in between the range, so it's adequate. The fat at 52 to 91, at 64 grams, that is also within the range. Consider that as adequate. What about the polyunsaturated fats? Well, 5 to 10% of the calories amounted to 13 to 26, but that person is only consuming 9 grams, not within the range. Actually, it's under the lower end, which is the 5%, which is 13 grams. So because of that, this person's intake is suboptimal. What about the monounsaturated fat? It's 11% or greater all the way up to 20%. That's 29 to 52 grams. So at 20 gram intake, that person's intake is clearly below the 29. Again, monounsaturated intakes are suboptimal. Saturated fat is less than 26 grams, which is less than 10% of the DRI calories, if you remember. This person's intake is 35 grams, clearly over that cutoff. Consequently, we can say that this person's intake is excessive. What about total sugar? Cutoff is less than 118 grams. Person's consuming 126. Intake is clearly excessive. Now, there's another way of looking at I would say the cardiovascular risk. It's called the PS ratio, or more appropriately, the P and MS ratio. That is the polyunsaturated monounsaturated divided by saturate ratio. So if we do this, we can get an idea of the relative proportion of the good fats, polyunsaturated and monounsaturated, relative to the bad fat, which is the saturated fat, which increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. The goal really is to bring this ratio greater than 1, and that means that there'd be a greater proportion of polyunsaturates and monounsaturates relative to saturated. So let's take a look. So if we do this, it's 9 grams plus 20 grams divided by the saturate 35 grams. And so we have a ratio of 0.83, which indicates that this is actually a poor ratio. It's under 1. It is likely to mean that the risk of cardiovascular disease is higher. The ideal is greater than 1. So we do have this ratio to give us some understanding to the proportionality and the quality of fat and what they represent with respect to the risk of cardiovascular disease. So having established the significance of the P-MS ratio, I'd like to add some perspective to it. Is it possible, do you think, that a person could still end up with an ideal ratio but still be at risk of cardiovascular disease? So the answer is yes. Let's take, for example, the following calculation. Let's stay with our 9 grams of poly and the 20 grams of monounsaturated fat. So we end up with 29. And now let's take a look at our saturated fat. And if our saturated fat is, for instance, at 27, let's look at the ratio. 29 divided by 27 gives us 1.07. That indicates that we are proportionally, it would seem, at better or higher, at good risk or low risk of cardiovascular disease. But when we actually look at the amount of saturated fat at 27, we are clearly above the saturated fat cutoff. So even though the ratio indicates a positive 1 greater than 1 risk, or greater than 1 ratio indicating low risk, the fact that the absolute values of saturated fat are greater than the cutoff supersedes what the ratio reveals to us and helps us to confirm with the patient that they are still dietarily consuming too much saturated fat. All right, so here's a recap. What's the PS ratio? It's the measurement of the proportion of good and healthy fats relative to the proportion of unhealthy fats. Which are the good fats? Monounsaturated fats tied to olive oil, oleic acid, and the Mediterranean diet. The polyunsaturated fats, the omega-6s, in addition to those that are called the omega-3s. These are all polyunsaturated fats. Unhealthy fats, saturated fats, and the trans fatty acids. So what is the ratio? It's the grams of monounsaturated fat plus the grams of polyunsaturated fat divided by the grams of saturated fat. All right, now, how about a visual example? Let's say we have polyunsaturated fats of 13 grams, monounsaturated fats of 32, and saturated fat of 24. So the PMS ratio would be the addition of the good fats divided by the bad fats. The goal is to achieve a ratio higher than 1 in order to have a diet, essentially, that indicates a low risk of heart disease. So this would mean adding the poly to the mono, that would be 13 plus 32, and divide that by 24, we'd get a ratio here of 45 over 24, or 1.87. This ratio is clearly over 1 and would be indicative of a low risk of heart disease. Remember, however, that your analysis of these particular fats are not complete until after the ratio you've also compared the absolute values 13, 33, or 32 and 24 to the cutoff values. In other words, comparing the 13 grams to the gram equivalent that you get out of 5 to 10% of the calories, the 32 that you compare to the 11 or greater, right up to 20% of the calories, and the 24 grams compared to the less than 10% of the DRI calories. And if the saturated fat in particular is over the cutoff of that is indicated for 10%, then it doesn't really matter what the ratio is saying, especially if it indicates a positive greater than 1. Because the saturated fat is over the cutoff, you still have to conclude that the patient is at risk dietarily of a diet high in risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, while it is clear that we discourage low intakes of nutrients, because we often call these situations suboptimal when it comes to key, important, and significant nutrients, we have to point out that there are nutrients for which the idea of being low is actually good. Dietary cholesterol, for example, less than 300 milligrams, is really a good thing. The goal here is not to reach 300 milligrams per day, it's to be under 300 milligrams per day. The same thing for saturated fat. The goal is to be under 10%, not to reach 10%. Trans fatty acids, the byproduct of hydrogenation, the products that we see in margarines and shortenings, the goal here is less than 1% of the DRI calories. Sodium, less than 2,400 milligrams per day based on the FDA guidelines. And here again, the goal is not to reach 2,400 milligrams, but really to stay under it. Same thing for sugar. We're not trying to reach 20% of our calories in sugar. We're trying to stay as low as we can under the total sugar cutoff. Added sugar, the government tells us, should be less than 10% of the DRI calories. And again, the added sugar is clearly the sugar that is found in manufactured goods. When we talk about total sugar, just as a matter of a recall here, total sugar includes all the natural sugars found in fruits and vegetables, in milk, in addition to the added sugar that's found in processing. Whereas added sugar is strictly tied to or associated with the sugar that has been added by the manufacturer who produces the food. So this is an exercise assessing a person's sugar intake. So if a man who requires 3,450 calories a day, remember these are the DRI calories, and if he consumes a total sugar intake of 175 grams, the question is, well, can you determine whether or not he's consuming excessive or adequate amount of sugar? Very quickly, The 20% cutoff is what you've got to remember. So 0.20 times 3450. Divide that by 4, and you get 173 grams per day as the cutoff. He's consuming 175, so the patient is clearly exceeding his cutoff, so his intake is unhealthy, or in other words, excessive. Part of assessing a person's nutrient intake also involves understanding the nutrient density of that person. In other words, the milligrams of nutrients per individual calorie. So, for instance, if your patient's consuming 300 milligrams of calcium in 1 cup of milk, which contains 125 calories, what is the nutrient density? Well, it's 300 milligrams, the quantity of calcium, found in the number of calories in that 1 cup, 125. That gives us a nutrient density of 2.4 milligrams per calorie. While we tend to encourage individuals to consume foods high in nutrient density, we discourage them from consuming foods that are high in caloric density. So caloric density really is the number of calories per gram of food. So we're comparing two products here, the donut and the apple. Donut highly processed, and the apple not processed at all. So the donut weighs 42 grams and contains 195 calories. The caloric density is the number of calories per weight of the donut, so 195 divided by 42, and we get 4.64 calories per gram. Let's compare that to the apple. 182 grams, 95 calories. If we do the caloric density, 95 calories divided by 182, we get 0.52 calories per gram. We can clearly see that the unprocessed fruit contains significantly less calories per weight. And this is really typically seen in all vegetables and fruits, and is a lesson for us, right? When we want to understand, where are the calories coming from? Well, they're coming from the processed foods that have virtually significant amounts of calories per individual weight.
In this section, we're going to take a look at how to understand food labels, how to interpret them properly so as to better make wise and wholesome food selections. Recently, there's been a change in the way the Nutrition Facts panel appears. On the left, we have the older version, and on the right, we have the newer version. Two very noticeable changes have taken place. First, the serving size is in bold and much bigger, and the number of calories per serving is certainly a lot bigger as well. And while the new Nutrition Facts panel is still based on a 2,000 calorie diet, we see that some of the daily values have actually changed. Let's take a closer look. The first notable change is the daily value for fat. Historically, the older one was 65 grams, but this newer one is really based on the upper percent range for fat, which is 35%, and that turns out to be about 78 grams. So when we take the 8 grams of fat that we see in the new panel and we divide it by 78, we get in fact 10%. The daily value for fiber used to be 25 grams, and now it's 28 grams. And finally, the daily value for carbohydrates used to be 60% of the DRI calories, is pretty much at 57% of the daily calorie requirement, which brings it to roughly 285 grams instead of 300 grams. One thing that's new is that the new Nutrition Facts panel has added sugar, and we know that the government's cutoff for added sugar is 10% of the DRI calories. This is a reminder as well that total sugar doesn't have any government cutoff that's imposed, but in the context of this class, because of support of NIH data, we are going to use less than 20% of the DRI calories as our cutoff for total sugar. Now, finally, how to interpret the Nutrition Facts panel. What do the actual values, numeric values, mean? Well, first, when we're looking at the micronutrients like iron or vitamin D or anything like that, you can say that it's an excellent source, that the food's an excellent source for that specific nutrient if the quantity is 20% or higher than the DV. It's a good source if it's 10 to 19.99 of the DV. It's not a good source if it's, basically 5 to 9.9, and it's a poor source if less than 5% of the daily value. Now, there are nutrients for which it's actually a good idea to be low. That would be for total fat. We don't want to have it so that it's a poor source, but we don't want it to be a high source either. Saturated fat is a bad fat. We want it low. Trans fats, we want it low. Sodium, we want it low. Total sugar and added sugar, we also want those beneath or below the cutoffs. So then when we're looking at these particular nutrients that aren't so good for us, there are several ways we can categorize them, either high, moderately high, modestly high, or in other words healthy, and or low. So high would be any of these rather not so good nutrients being greater or equal to 20% of the DV. Moderately high would be 10 to 19%. Modestly high, or what we could also call healthy, would be contained within 5 to 9% of the DV. And of course, it would be considered low if it was less than 5%. All right, so in summary, this is what we see on the new nutrition facts panel. First of all, the serving size is a much larger print, so is the calories per serving. And we know that the daily values have actually changed for some of them. Here are the highlights. So carbohydrates went from 300 grams to 285. Total fat went from 65 to 78 grams. And fiber went from 25 grams all the way up to 28 grams.
The FDA has established new rules to guide manufacturers in their labeling of food, specifically whether or not a food could be labeled as healthy. So here are the new guidelines for foods to be labeled as healthy. They must not be low in total fat, but have a fat profile makeup that is visible on the label, that predominantly shows the monounsaturated fats and the polyunsaturated fats, and the combined addition or summation of these two fats must be more than the amount of saturated fat. So in other words, the PS ratio must be greater than 1. Second, or they can contain at least 10% of the daily value per reference amount customarily consumed of potassium or vitamin D. So that makes them good sources of vitamin D or potassium. So next, I'm going to review some key calculations. It's important to know these cold. That basically means that you're able to do them without hesitation and with great fluidity, minimizing, of course, any errors that you would do because you've practiced them repeatedly. So I encourage you to practice these calculations so that you become very proficient at executing them. So before beginning, I'd like to remind you of the importance of being able to transform your given information regarding height and weight into the metric system, because a lot of these formulas use the metric system, not the imperial system. So it's important to know these cold. But I will highlight in this list the ones that you absolutely need to know. First, you need to know that 1 pound is equal to 454 grams. Memorize this. Memorize as well that 1 pound is also equal to 0.454 kilograms. That 1 kilogram is equal to 2.2 pounds. And that 1 inch is equal to 2.54 centimeters, or that 1 inch is equal to 0.0254 meters. So it's important that you have this memorized so that you can then execute these equations with greater fluidity and ease. So here's one example where the metric conversion is very important. So you have a man or patient, a client at 189 pounds, and you're about to plug his weight into the formula for establishing his resting energy expenditure. But that formula requires the weight in kilograms. So what do? You convert the weight in pounds right into kilos. How do you do that? Well, 1 pound, if you remember, is 454 grams, or to make the conversion faster, 0.454 kilograms. Consequently, 189 pounds would be equal to 189 times 0.454 kilograms, or 85.81 kilograms. It's very important to keep 2 units after the decimal point. Do not round up body weights. You will also need to convert that patient's height into centimeters or meters depending on the equation. So if a man is 5 feet 10 inches tall, then you need to convert 5 feet 10 inches into total number of inches. So first you've got to remember that 1 inch is equal to 2.54 centimeters. And in the case where the equation may require meters, you can simply say 1 inch is equal to 0.0254 meters. So consequently, 5 feet 10 inches is equal to 70 inches. 5 feet times 12, 60 plus 10, 70. And then 70 times 2.54 gives 177.8 centimeters. Again, leave 1 or 2 numbers after the decimal point, but don't round them up. Here's a little problem to help you work with the decimal points. So if a man weighs 189 pounds, what would his weight be in grams? Now, grams would be an unusual unit to use for weight. It's usually kilograms. But I'm using grams here to see if you know how to use the decimal points. So I'll let you work on this and reveal the answer on the next slide. All right, the correct answer would be D. Now let's take a look at how this particular calculation was done. If we take the 189 pounds, we multiply it by 0.454, as we previously indicated, to get the kilogram weight, we get a kilogram weight of 85.81 kilograms. We know that 1 kilogram is equal to 1,000 grams. So then 85.8 times 1,000 gives us 85,806 grams. So that turns out to be D. Now let's do a similar calculation using height. So if we have a man whose height is 5 feet 7 inches, what would it be in centimeters? So I'll pause here and indicate the answer on the next slide. The correct answer would be 170.18. So again, the thing to remember is that 1 inch is equal to 2.54 centimeters. So we need to calculate the number of inches in 5 feet 7 inches. So that's 67 inches. 5 times 12, 60, plus the 7 inches, 67. 67 inches times 2.54 centimeters per inch gives us 170.18 centimeters. Let's try another one. A woman who is 5 feet 10 inches tall would be how many meters tall? Again, always remember that 1 inch is equal to 2.54 centimeters, or 1 inch is equal to 0.0254 meters. So 5 feet 10 inches would be 70 inches. And since 1 inch is equal to 0.0254 meters, we would just multiply 70 times 0.0254, and we would get 1.78 meters. So the correct answer would be B. Well, now I'm reintroducing percent calculations as I did at the beginning of the course. So now I want you to calculate the percent fat calories in a slice of pie. If the slice of pie contains a total of 350 calories, and if there are 32 grams of fat per serving, what percent of the calories are coming from fat? I'll pause the video here, calculate your answer, and I'll reveal it on the next slide. The correct answer is 82.28%. How did I calculate it? Well, there's 32 grams of fat, so we'll get the fat calories by multiplying 32 by 9, and that's 288. And the one slice of pie had 350 calories, so we divide that amount by 350 calories, and we get 82.28%. Let's do another problem. If your diet contains 300 grams of carbohydrate, identify how many calories would come from carbohydrates. Now this one is relatively easy since we know that there are 4 calories for every gram of carbohydrate, and since there are 300 grams, the answer would be C, 1200 calories. So let's try this problem. If a hamburger patty weighing 2 ounces contains 14 grams of protein and 16 grams of fat, how many calories or kilocalories are in the patty? So the answer will be dependent on you acknowledging that calories come, in this case, from protein and from fat, and that there are 4 calories for every gram of protein, 9 calories for every gram of fat. So now it's a matter of identifying correctly what the calories and or kilocalories are in this patty. So let's do the calculations. First, we do the protein calculation. We have 14 grams times 4. So we have 56 calories coming from protein, 16 grams of fat. So that means that we have 144 calories coming from fat, plus the 56 from protein gives us 200 kilocalories. But we also know that there are that 1 calorie or 1,000 calories is found in 1 kilocalorie. So we would need to multiply the 200 by 1,000, and we would get 200,000 calories. So we actually have A and D being correct. 200 kilocalories is indeed equal to 200,000 calories. But in nutrition, when we speak about calories we generally refer to as the kilocalories. So for instance, a person whose daily energy requirement is 2,800 calories, we really are jargonizing. That is indeed 2,800 kilocalories. Let's do another percent calculation. So a food contains a total of 650 calories with a fat content equal to 44 grams of fat. What percent of the calories are coming from fat? Time to pause the video. I'll give you the answer on the next slide. The correct answer is roughly 61%. How is this calculated? Well, remember, first of all, don't make the critical mistake of dividing grams by calories. When you're doing a percentage, it has to be the numerator having the same unit as the denominator. That's a very basic principle. 10 apples over 100 apples. So you can't have 44 grams over 650 calories. So you've got to convert the grams, 44, into calories, 9 calories for every gram. So we have 396 fat calories, and we divide that by the total, which is 650, and multiply it by 100, and we get 61%. Another way to visualize or help a patient visualize the sugar content that they are consuming, for example, in a 12-ounce fluid Coke. So if we look at the ingredients, and there's 39 grams of sugar, a good way to use to help the patient understand how much they're actually consuming in sugar is to convert the grams into teaspoons. And so what we understand is 1 teaspoon is equal to 4 grams of sugar. So this is very important to remember because it helps in that conversion. So 39 grams then divided by 4 gives us 9.75 teaspoons of sugar. Or a dietitian would basically say, Mrs. Smith, in that 12-ounce fluid ounce of Coke, you're consuming roughly 12 or 10 teaspoons of sugar. So now let's consider a calculation that looks at yearly sugar consumption. That also is very helpful to bringing a patient to understanding how much sugar they're actually consuming. So if your patient is consuming 8 ounces of fruit juice 4 times per day every day, and the sugar content is 30 grams per 8-ounce cup, determine the pounds of sugar consumed per year. So 30 grams of sugar multiplied by 4 gives us 120 grams of sugar per day, right? Because that 8-ounce cup is consumed 4 times. So that's 120 grams of sugar per day. And since they're consuming this amount every day, that's 365 days a year, then the person is consuming 43,800 grams of sugar per year. That's 120 times the number of days in a year, 365. Now, since 1 pound is equal to 454 grams, then the 43,800 grams, if you divide it by 454 grams, will give you the number of pounds. That's 96.48 pounds of sugar per year, just from the consumption of 8-ounce fruit juice 4 times a day. Let's do another calculation. Determine the yearly intake of sugar, but break it down into monthly intakes. So a man consumes 3 12-ounce Mountain Dews per day, containing 46 grams of sugar per 12 fluid ounces, 3 days per week. How many pounds of sugar does he consume on average per month over that year? Let me pause right here, right? So pause the video and I'll give you the answer on the next slide. Right, the correct answer is 3.95 pounds per month. So how did we calculate this? Well, let's consider the number of grams of sugar consumed per day. So the patient consumes 3 12 fluid ounce Mountain Dews per day, and 1 12 fluid ounce contains 46 grams. So 46 times 3 gives us the number of grams of sugar per consumed day. So 138. He consumes that 3 days a week. So let's multiply that by 3. And what we get is 414 grams per week. We know there are 52 weeks in a year. There are not 4 weeks in a month. That is actually incorrect. So the only certifiable way to approach this is to recognize for certain that there are 52 weeks in a year. So if we have the number of grams of sugar for a week, we multiply that by 52. And we get the number of grams of sugar for a year, 21,528. That amount can then be divided by 12 because we know that there are 12 months in a year. So divide that by 12, and that gives us 1,794 grams of sugar per month. Well, since there are 454 grams in a pound, divide that amount by 454, and you get 3.95 pounds per month. All right, in this next question, we're going to go back to the teaspoon concept. So if a person consumes 6 20 fluid ounce Mountain Dews per day, that's a lot. How much sugar per year does he consume if one 20 fluid ounce container of Mountain Dew has 16 teaspoons of sugar? I'll pause it right here. And then the next slide, I'll reveal the answer. The correct answer to this problem is 309 pounds. So let's do the calculation. First, we know there's 16 teaspoons of sugar in a 20 fluid ounce Mountain Dew. How many grams? Well, 16 times 4, because there are 4 grams for every teaspoon. So we have 64 grams of sugar in every 20 fluid ounce of Mountain Dew. The person consumes 6 of these every day. So times 6 means that they're consuming 384 grams of sugar every day, and there are 365 days in a year, so multiply that by 365, and you should get 140,160 grams. There are 454 grams in a pound, so if we divide that by 454, we will get 308.72, or rounded up, 309 pounds of sugar. So here's another problem that helps you with some quantification. So one 156 gram bag of potato chips contains what quantity of fat if 1 ounce of chips equals 10 grams of fat? Pause the video here and I'll reveal the answer on the next slide. The correct answer is B, 55.71 grams. Let's see how I calculated this. I begin with recognizing that in 1 ounce chips, there's 10 grams of fat. But I have a problem. The bag weighs 156 grams. So I have to convert the 1 ounce of chips into grams of chips. And I know, or at least you should know, that 1 ounce is equal to 28 grams. So if I know that 28 grams of chips has 10 grams of fat, then I can determine how much fat is in 156 grams of chips. So that's 156 grams times 10 divided by 28. The answer, B.
So now I want to look at what we regard as a nutrient density. This is something that a dietitian or nutritionist wants his patient to consume, a diet high in nutrient density. So how is it represented? The correct answer is C. It's the quantity of nutrient expressed as milligrams or micrograms per individual calorie.
Let's do a nutrient density calculation. Calculate the nutrient density of one 156 gram fresh baked potato if the niacin content of that potato is 2.8 milligrams and the calories found in that potato is 145 calories. I'll pause here and I'll reveal the answer on the next slide. So the correct answer is 15 micrograms per kilocalorie. So let's take a look at how I calculated this. Well, first we understand that nutrient density is the quantity divided by the calories. So the quantity here is 2.18 milligrams. So we're going to divide that by the number of calories, which is 145 calories in that potato. And we end up with 0.015 milligrams per calorie. And you can see in option C that isn't the correct answer. C is 0.0015. The correct answer in milligrams would be 0.015 milligrams per calorie. So C is wrong because it's actually 10 times smaller. Now, what about 15 micrograms? Well, the idea is that the microgram is 1,000 times smaller than the actual milligram. So we would have to then multiply 0.015 by 1,000 and change, of course, the unit. So if we multiply that, 1,000, we end up with 15.03, and in this case, it would be micrograms. So it's important to have a little bit of flexibility here in terms of understanding micrograms and milligrams. So for ease, we could say, for instance, that 1,000 grams is equal to 1 kilogram. We can also add to that 1,000 milligrams is equal to 1 gram. And now to better understand this problem, we can say that 1,000 micrograms is equal to 1 milligram. This should help you to better understand the resolution of the previous problem. In nutrient counseling, while we advocate for foods of high nutrient density, we actually try to encourage individuals to eat foods of low caloric density. So, in this particular question, let's see how much you understand of caloric density. What is the caloric density of a 156-gram bag of potatoes if the total calories is equal to 836 calories? Pause the video here. I'll show you the answer on the next slide. Hopefully you remembered the definition. It's the number of calories per gram weight of the product. So we have 836 calories in a bag of potato chips that weighs 156 grams. So we can take 836 divided by 156 and we get 5.36 calories per gram. Now I want to spend some time looking at the key calculations used for the determination of energy needs and for diet prescription. The first calculation that I'd like to introduce to you is the determining of resting energy expenditure, or REE. The method recommended in the book is to begin with the Mifflin equation. This establishes the resting energy expenditure, which is the first step in determining the total energy expenditure, which we'll see later on. So I'd like to show you that in this equation, the men and women equations are very similar. The women is 5 times the age plus 161, and for the male it's 5 times the age minus 5 in the last bracket. But aside from that, the two equations resemble each other, and you can see why we were determining the metric conversions, because in this first one for men it's 10 times the weight in kilograms. So you need to take that body weight, as we were doing previously, multiply it by 0.454 and insert it in this particular parentheses. The height is in centimeters, so height in inches times 6.25. And so the approach here is, first of all, memorize this equation, know it cold, so that all you need to do is insert by memory into your calculator the different parameters, adding them together and subtracting and coming up with the REE. When I do this in the classroom, students can eventually do this in 45 seconds. So I recommend this particular objective for you as you practice this equation to do it under a minute. Now, the REE is really the energy expended by the individual when they are in the supine or the lying down position. So it's the resting energy expenditure. So it really is measuring the energy that is used by the organs and the muscles and the brain while in a state of relaxation. Let's do an example. A 35-year-old man weighing 250 pounds with a height of 5'10". Determine this individual's resting energy expenditure using the Mifflin equation. So I have the Mifflin equation written out here. And if you've memorized it, then you will do first the conversion of the body weight. So 250 pounds times 0.454. and you get 113.5. So that 113.5, because you've memorized it, will multiply the 10, and that gives you basically 1,135. Now you can write this down quickly on a piece of paper. The next thing is 5'10", so that's 70 inches. 70 inches times 2.54 to get the centimeters, so 70 times 2.54. And you get 177.8. That 177.8, you know by memory, gets multiplied by 6.25, and you get 1,111.25. That value will then add to the 1,135 from the previous parentheses, and you will get then the total for the first bracket, which would be 2,246.25. The next is to do the age, and so it's 5 times his age minus 5, and so then that value is minus 170. So when we actually add the 1,135 to the 1,111.25 minus the 70, we get 2,076 calories. Now, this gives us the resting energy expenditure, but now in order to get the total energy expenditure, we need to multiply that by an activity factor. My choice of activity factors are going to be selected from table 2.4 in your textbook. And I've summarized them right here, but this is just a brief example of what you'll find. But the idea being that if you're doing a light activity, it's going to be 1.53 for a man and for a woman. A moderate activity is 1.76 and a heavy activity is 2.25. So in order to get the total energy level, if we're using, for example, a moderate activity, you would take the REE, which we just determined, times the activity level of moderate activity, 1.76, and that gives us 3,654 calories. This is the total energy expenditure of the individual. So the amount of energy required for consumption in order to maintain a stable. Now, the second method for determining not the REE but the TEE, and it can be done in just one equation, is called the Garrier equation. And you can see it's a little bit more complicated, so consequently I don't require that students memorize this one, but it would be a really good idea to write down on a cheat sheet the two equations for men and women. So for a man, for example, who's very active, we're going to look at the TEE being equal to 864 minus, and in the parentheses, 9.72 times the age in years. And that forms the first bracket. So this is the one you should begin with, plus the physical activity. Your choice of physical activity, if you're using the Garrier equation, is table 2.5 in your textbook. This physical activity that you'll select, in the case of a very active individual, and if it's a man, you'll be using activity factor 1.54. If it was a woman that was very active, it would be 1.45. So consult table 2.5. Now, I want you to take note of the physical activity multiplying the addition of 14.2 times the weight and of 503 times the height, right? So it's the two together that are actually getting multiplied by the PA, or the physical activity. So now I want to resolve this equation. So just go down to the second level, and we see that the 8.64 minus 9.72 times the age, and the age is 35. So really what we do is resolve that first bracket. So 9.72 times 35, and that value will be subtracted from 864. And so you can write down on a piece of paper the first bracket, 523.8. Now, the activity factor is 1.54, and that's going to multiply 14.2 times the weight. So the weight's got to be in kilograms. So it's 14.2 times 113.5. And then the height is got to be made into meters, not centimeters. That's 503 times 1.78. So what you're looking at is the 1.54 multiplying the summation of those two last parentheses. So I've tried to break down the calculations for you. So now down to the lower level, we have the TEE with the first bracket, 523.8, plus, then we have 1,611.7 plus 895.3 within, when combined together within that parentheses. And we have the activity factor multiplying the addition of those two. So when we do that, the 1 1,611.7 plus 895.3 times 1.54, that gives 3,861. That gets added then to the 523.8, which you did initially, and that gives us the calories of 4,385 calories. This is the total energy expenditure of that individual who is very active. So students should spend a considerable amount of time rehearsing different problems with the Carrier equation, again using the cheat sheet, and avoiding having to write down everything. Remember, if you have the cheat sheet, you can visualize where you can enter your numbers and then maybe jot down maybe one or two numbers that come out of your calculator. The idea is that when I do this in class, students do it in about a minute 30 seconds on average. So I would encourage students to try this particular equation and train enough that you would get the answer, the correct answer 9 times out of 10 within about a minute to a minute and 30 seconds. This will allow you to perform well on the rapid response quiz. Now in this section, I'm going to show you how to prescribe a diet to a patient. Given his total caloric requirements of 4,385 calories per day, for instance, it would be pertinent to prescribe certain amounts of carbs and proteins and fat. And I want to show you how to proceed. So to prescribe appropriately, you need to follow the macronutrient range recommendations for healthy eating. So you need to know that carbohydrates, the recommendation there is for 45 to 65% of the DRI calories. Again, I always mention DRI calories because I want students to remember that when you establish these ranges, you're not using the person's actual calorie consumption, but the recommended calories that they should be consuming. Protein 10 to 35 and fat 20 to 35%. So these are the percent ranges from which you can select for your specific patient's needs. So as the dietitians, for example, I will be selecting my specific carbohydrate, protein, fat prescription based on those recommendations we just saw. So for instance, in my prescription for my particular patient, I might prescribe 60% of the calories coming from carbs. This is actually quite consistent with the range 45 to 65. My protein perhaps might be 15% of the calories. That's clearly between the 10 to 35. Or I might actually use body weight. Maybe the equivalent here of about 1.35 grams per kilogram body weight of protein. Remembering that the weight or the gram amount of protein per body weight is a more precise way of prescribing protein. And fat, I might prescribe 25%, and I can see here that it's clearly between the healthy range of 20 to 35%. So if my patient's energy requirement is 4,385 calories a day, then I would say if 60% of my calories are coming from carbs, I can calculate the gram amount of carbs that patient would receive. That would be 0.6 times 4,385 divided by 4, 658 grams of carb. Protein at 15%, 0.15 times 4,385 calories. Divide that by 4, because there are 4 calories from every gram. That gives me 164 grams of protein. And then 25% from fat, 0.25 times 4,385. Divide this by 9, and that's 122 grams. Now make sure that the addition of these percentages come up to 100. So let's just verify. 60 plus 15, that's 75, plus the 25 from fat is indeed 100%.
So I'd like to take a closer look at the various recommendations for fluid requirements. In 1945, the Nutrition Food Board of the National Research Council recommended about 1 ml per kilocalorie. So that means that an individual, for instance, whose requirement is 2,000 calories a day would require 2,000 milliliters. Now that total would account for the liquids that we consume in food as well as from drink. The NHANES study that was conducted between 1988 and 1994 showed basically that the AI for young adults and middle-aged adults should be about 3.7 liters for men and 2.7 liters for women. That would be the total water intake, and that would also include the water in the food. At a practical level, this means that given that 20% of our fluids come from food, organizations like the ESPEN organization recognizes that the actual amount of fluid ingested by women should be about 1.6 liters a day, and by men about 2 liters a day. So now let's take a closer look at these recommendations. If we look at the ranges of 2.5 to 3.7 liters for men and 2 to 2.7 liters for women, we know that this AI is referring to the total fluid requirement for the body, which includes fluids that we drink and the fluids that are found in the food. Is there a way to reconcile that with the ESPEN guidelines, which appear to be less, but which pertain to the actual fluid that we need to drink? So now if we estimate 80% of these liter volumes, we will derive the volume of fluid that we need to drink. Well, if we take the lower end of each range, so notably 2 liters for women and 2.5 liters for men, and we calculate 80% of that a minimum recommendation, notably 2 liters for women, we end up with 1.6 liters for women. If we do the 2.5 liters and calculate 80%, we end up with 2 liters per day for men. So indeed, the AI and the ESPEN guidelines can be reconciled.
Right now I have a set of training mini quizzes that you can do with this particular presentation. They're not compiled and they don't go towards your grade sheet, but they are an excellent way to train and really understand, make sure that you understand the key concepts. Identify below the recommended carbohydrate intake in order to meet the healthy macronutrient range for carbohydrate. The answer, D, 45 to 65%. Next question, identify below the recommended protein intake in order to meet the healthy macronutrient range for protein. The answer is C, 10 to 35% of DRI calories. Next, identify below the recommended fat intake in order to meet the healthy macronutrient range for fat. The answer, C, 20 to 35% of DRI calories. A man weighing 189 pounds with a height of 5'9", calculate his weight in kilograms. The answer, 85.81 kilograms. Calculated as follows, 189 pounds times 0.454 kilograms. Another question, a man weighing 189 pounds whose height is 5'9", calculate his height in meters. The answer for this one is C, 1.75 meters. How was this calculated? You have to recall the conversion. 1 inch equals 2.54 centimeters. Since we're working in meters, we can say 1 inch equals 0.0254 meters. So now you take the 5 feet 9 inches, which is 69 inches, times 0.0254, and you get C, 1.75 meters. Next question. A woman drinks 5 12 fluid ounce Cokes a day, 5 days a week. If one 12 fluid ounce Coke contains 12 teaspoons of sugar, how many pounds of sugar does she consume after 1 week? So pause this video, calculate, and I'll reveal the answer on the next slide. The answer is C. How did we calculate this? Well, a 12 fluid ounce Coke has 12 teaspoons. So let's see how many grams there is in one 12 fluid ounce Coke. So 4 grams per teaspoon. So there's 48 grams of sugar in one 12 fluid ounce Coke. The person drinks 5 of these a day. So times 5. So in a full day consumption, this person drinks 240 grams of sugar. She does this 5 days a week. So we multiply that amount times 5 and we get 1200 grams. Since 1 pound equals 454 grams, we divide the 1200 by 454 and we get 2.64 pounds. Here's another question about sugar. So a woman drinks 5 12 fluid ounce Cokes a day, 5 days a week. If there are 12 teaspoons in a 12 fluid ounce Coke, how many pounds of sugar does she consume after 1 month? Pause here and I'll reveal the answer on the next slide. The correct answer is actually E, 11.45 pounds. So how is this done? Well, similar to the previous one, 12 teaspoons of sugar in one 12 ounce. So 4 grams per teaspoon, so that's 48 grams. The person consumes it 5 times a day, so that's 240 grams a day. Consumes it 5 times a week, so times 5. So on a weekly basis, 1,200 grams. Now, that's per week. We're looking at per month, so we have to go first per year because we know there are 52 weeks in a year, so we'll do that times 52. So that's 62,400 grams per year, and we know that there are 12 months in a year, so we can divide that by 12, and we get 5,200 grams per month. And since there are 454 grams in a pound, we divide that by 454, and we get 1145 pounds per month. So now let's do an estimate for 1 year. Same description. A woman drinks 5 12 fluid ounce Cokes a day, 5 days a week. If one 12 ounce Coke has 12 teaspoons, how many pounds at the end of 1 year? I'll pause here, do the calculations, and I'll provide the answer on the next slide. The answer that you should have come up with is 137.4 pounds per year. So back to the 12 teaspoons, that's 48 grams of sugar. That's taken 5 times a day. So that turns into 240 grams of sugar a day. And then we then multiply that by 5 for 5 times a week. That equals 1,200 grams a week. And there are 52 weeks in 1 year. So you multiply that amount by 52. And you get 62,400 grams of sugar. And you know that 1 pound is 454 grams. So divide that by 454. And you get the 137.4 pounds of sugar per year. Before you commence this problem, be sure that you memorize the Mifflin equation. And now this will give you an opportunity to practice with a memorized equation. So now looking at this particular problem, you can see it's a man, so that means you need to draw the male Mifflin equation, which is 10 times the weight in kilograms, plus 6.25 the height in centimeters, close brackets, minus, open brackets, 5 times the age minus 5, close brackets. The goal now is to complete this equation in 45 seconds. So you're only going to jot down on a piece of paper perhaps 2 numbers. The rest will simply be put into the calculator having memorized the equation. So the first thing is that the weight needs to be transformed into kilograms. 1.78 times 0.454 equals 80.81. And you know that amount gets multiplied by 10. So immediately multiply that amount by 10 and you get 801.12. Jot that number down. 808.12. Now let's move to the height. The height then needs to be transformed into inches. So 6 feet is 72 inches plus 2 is 74. This is using centimeters, so that's 2.54 centimeters to an inch. So multiply 74 by 2.54. That amount is 187.96, and you know by memory that that amount gets multiplied by 6.25, and the number you jot down here, or that you don't actually jot down, that you see is 1174.75. That amount actually gets added to the number you just jotted down, which is the 808.12. So let's do that. 1174.75 plus 808.12. And now you get the first number that goes into the first bracket, 1982.87. Next, we subtract the age factor. So remember, this is a man, so the age is 55 times 5 minus 5. The number you get is 270. This amount will be subtracted from the first number in your bracket, 1982.87. So let's do the calculation. 1982.87 minus 270. The answer you should get is 1713, or 1713 kilocalories. This is the resting energy expenditure as determined by the Mifflin equation. Now, if one slice of pizza contains 43 grams of fat, and if the slice has 631 calories, what percent of the calories come from fat? Pause here, do the calculation. I'll reveal the answer on the next slide. The answer you should have come up with is D, 61.33%. Let's do the calculation. 43 grams of fat. Remember, you can't do 43 over 631. They're two different units. So 43 grams have got to be transformed into calories, and that is done by multiplying by 9. So we have 387 fat calories divided by 631 total calories times 100. We get 61.33% D. This question is about using the Garrier equation for total energy expenditure. And I have here outlined the formula. What we know about the case is that it's a man who's 27 years old, whose weight is 173 pounds, whose height is 5'11", and whose activity factor we have here is equal to 1.27. If you consult table 2.5 in your textbook, you'll see that 1.27 for a man is active. So at this point, you should pause the video, do the calculations using the Garrier equation for a man, and then reopen or restart the video, and I'll show you the answer and explain it. If you're well practiced, you should be able to do this particular resolution in 1 minute 30 seconds. So for this kind of a problem, because the Garrier equation is difficult to memorize, you should have it down as a cheat sheet right in front of you, and don't waste your time jotting every single number down or rewriting the equation. That's the value of the cheat sheet. So the first place to start is with the first bracket dealing with the age. So let's do that by entering the number or the age of the person. So it's 27 years old times 9.72. That gives us 262.44. That subtracts 864. And we get 601.56. That goes in to your first bracket. Put a bracket around it so you don't get mixed up in your numbers. Next, we replace the PA by the actual activity factor, or AF. And so in the place of PA, we put 1.27, and that is going to multiply the summation of the weight and height factors. So after you've done that, then you need to convert the body weight into kilograms. So let's do that. 173 times 0.454. And we get 78.54. That value then multiplies 14.2, and we get 11, 15, 30. Jot that down, and then now move to the age, or to the height, sorry. So the height is 5 feet 11, so that's 71 inches. Remember here we're working in meters, so 71 inches times 0.0254. So that gives us 1.8034 meters. Just leave that into your calculator reading. And that height in meters then multiplies 503, and so we get 907.11. No need to write that one down. Now simply add it to the weight factor that you previously did, which is 1115.30. So that gets added plus 1115.30. That forms the total number of the second bracket. That value then multiplies 1.27. So we do that. And we should get 2,568, 2,568.46. That value then adds the value you obtained in your first bracket, 601.56. So this value then adds 601.56, and you get 3,170. Here's a dietary reference intake question. What DRI is used by government policymakers in order to establish agricultural policies for a nation based on mean population needs? Pause here, think about it, and put down your answer. I'll reveal the correct answer immediately after. The correct answer is D, the EAR, the estimated average requirement. This is the requirement that's established to meet the needs of 50% of the population. The next DRI question is, which of the following statements is true regarding the RDA? Pause the movie and select your answer. The correct answer is B. The risk of nutrient deficiency actually increases the further the intake of that nutrient falls below the RDA. So what we determined in the class is when you're less or equal to 66% of the RDA, you're at a very high risk of deficiency. But when you're at 75%, the risk is not quite as high statistically, but this actual statement holds true. The further you drop below, the greater the risk of a deficiency occurring. Here's another DRI question. The EAR meets the needs of what percent of the population? Stop the video here. I'll reveal the answer on the next slide. The correct answer to this one is C, 50% of the population. The EAR is the estimated average requirement, and it's scientifically determined in order to meet the needs of 50% of the population. And a reminder that the RDA is determined by adding 2 standard deviations to the EAR in order to meet the needs of 98% of the population. Here's a critical thinking question. You're trying to teach a client how to possibly lower blood cholesterol levels by consuming foods high in fiber. Which of the following foods would be least effective for this purpose? Pause the video, think about it, maybe read a bit about fiber in your chapter, and then I'll reveal the correct answer on the next slide. Because it's well recognized that soluble fibers are effective in decreasing cholesterol, we can identify whole wheat bread, which is mostly insoluble fiber, as being a food the least effective in bringing down blood cholesterol. Here's a question to see if you memorize the essential amino acids. If you haven't, go back to the earlier slides of this program and apply yourself to memorize all 9 of the essential amino acids. And in this question, correctly identify the list made up of only essential amino acids. Pause here, Review your material, select your answer, and I'll reveal the correct answer after the next slide. If you memorize that sentence correctly, then it should sound something like this. Lucy and Valerie, all three lied about having met for an historical, phenomenal trip. And we can see that and so Lucy is iso, or also Lucy, 3, Lucy, and phenylalanine for phenomenal. So B is the correct answer. Now for a calculation question. A man weighing 170 pounds consumes 3,050 calories and has a DRI requirement for 3,350 calories. Identify below his lower cutoff for monounsaturated fat. Pause here, figure out your answer, select, and I'll reveal the answer on the next slide. To answer this question correctly, you have to have memorized the recommended cutoff for the fats. For monounsaturated fat, you should know that it's equal to or greater than 11%. If you don't know this, then you need to go back to focus box 2.1 and look at the second column in the table, and this is the second column that you're supposed to memorize. Here you'll see monounsaturated fats greater or equal than 11% of the DRI calories, and you can read about it a little bit more in the second paragraph, page 54. If you did the correct calculation, then you should have the following answer, B, greater or equal to 41 grams. How was that calculation done? Well, first of all, a reminder that when you're looking at cutoffs or standards, you never use the calories consumed, but really the calories recommended, the DRIs. So you would end up with the wrong answer if you use 3050, the correct answer if you use 3350. So that's the recommended amount of energy, and it's 11% or greater. So let's do 11% times 0.11. That gives us 368.5 calories, and we need to divide that by 9 because it's a fat, and we get 40.9, or in other words 41 grams of monounsaturated fat or more. Here's another DRI question. Identify the daily value for carbohydrates that was used on the old nutrition facts panel. Pause here, find your answer. If you remember, the FDA estimated this daily value assuming a 2,000 calorie diet and 60% of those calories coming from carbohydrates. So if you do the calculation, 2,000 times 0.6, that's 1,200 calories. Divide that by 4, and that leaves you with 300 grams of carbohydrate. The new facts panel has 285 grams of carbohydrates as the DV. Here's another DRI question. Identify the daily value for fiber used on the old nutrition facts panel. Pause here and find your answer. The correct answer is D, 25 grams. The new Nutrition Facts panel has the DV at 28 grams. Before answering this question, be sure to consult figure 2.5 in your textbook and learn those oils very well. So the question is, which of the following vegetable oils is a good source of omega-3 alpha linolenic acid? Pause here and try to figure out the correct answer. In consulting figure 2.5, you should be able to remember here that flaxseed has the highest concentration of linolenic acid, the omega-3 fatty acid. So the answer is E. Omega-3 fatty acids that are found in flaxseed are also found in fish oils, and consequently they tend to be anti-inflammatory and antithrombotic, therefore decreasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, by contrast, the omega-6 fatty acids, which are really the yellow oils, the oils that are rich in linoleic acid, these are pro-inflammatory once you start consuming more than 10% of the DRI calories. And so they tend to increase the risk of cardiovascular accidents through inflammation, or we call microinflammation. Now for another oil question. Which of the oils are rich in monounsaturated fats? Pause here and select your correct answer. You will note that the correct answer is E, B, and C. So beef tallow, even though it has a lot of saturated fat, actually has a significant amount of monounsaturated fat. And of course, the oil that has the most amount of monounsaturated oil is olive oil. Here's another oil question. Which of the oils are rich in monounsaturated fats? The correct answer is B, peanut oil, olive oil, and canola oil. If you're having trouble with this, memorize figure 2.5. You need to know this cold. Next question. What is the daily value for total fat used on the new Nutrition Facts panel? Pause here and determine your correct answer. You'll remember that the old Facts panel used to assume 30% of a 2,000 calorie diet. Now the new Facts panel assumes the upper level of healthy fat, which is 35% of a 2,000 calorie diet, and that is 78 grams. Here's an interesting assessment question regarding fiber. The Nutrition Facts panel on breakfast cereals indicate that one serving contains 3 grams of fiber. How would you rate that cereal based on our standard understanding of how to interpret the Facts panel? You'll recall that the new daily value for the new Facts panel is 28 grams. So 3 divided by 28 times 100 gives us approximately 11%. So this is considered a good source of fiber because it's between 10 and 19.9% of the daily value. The next question pertains to total sugar. The Nutrition Facts panel on a breakfast cereal indicates that one serving contains 16 grams of sugar. How would you rate the sugar content of the cereal based on the standard 2,000 kilocalorie a day diet? Pause here and select your answer. The correct answer would be B, moderately high in sugar. How is this calculated? Again, remember the cutoff for total sugar is not established by the government, but we can, within the context of this course, use the NIH data that basically says 20% or less than 20% of calories should come from sugar, because over that, dietary quality goes down. So if we use 20%, we can calculate 20% of 2,000 divided by 4 gives us 100 grams. So 16 over 100 is 16%. So we know that the percentage interpretation is as follows. 10 to 19.9 is essentially moderately high in sugar. Here's a Mifflin equation. And here is specifically what you're trying to achieve is the resting energy expenditure of a 24-year-old woman with a weight of 223 pounds and a height of 5 foot 7 inches. So the goal here is to come up with the resolution within about 45 seconds. So pause here and time yourself. You should have memorized the Mifflin equation. The correct answer to this question is D, 1,795 calories. How was this determined? Well, very quickly, the weight, 223 times 0.454, 101.24 times 10, and that gives us 1012.42. We then move over to the height, 57, or 5 feet 7 inches, 67 inches times 2.54, and that amount times 6.25 This gives you 1063.63. You add that to the number you previously counted, which is 1012.42, and you end up with 2076 in the first bracket. Now the age, 24 times 5, plus 161. So 281 will subtract 2076, and you end up with 1,795 calories. Please continue to practice until you can do this in about 45 seconds. In this question, identify below which of the 5 food products are considered healthy based on the new government criteria. Pause the video and make your selection. Well, can it be option A? Well, let's take a look at it. So 3 grams of fat based on the new DV of 78 represents really a 3.8% of the DV. So automatically we can rule out A because it's less than 5%. Remember, fat cannot be low, the fat content cannot be low. So let's go to 3.5. 3.5, divide that by 78 grams, and we get 4.5. And so we're still less than 5%. What if we do 5 grams? So 5 divided by 78, and we get 6.4. So at least we meet the criteria here in number C that it's not low in fat. Now let's look at the fat profile. The PUFA and the MUFAs together need to be more than the saturated fat. If we do that, we get to see that actually PUFA and MUFA together is 4.5, and the saturated is fat. So the saturated is 0.5. So we see a better profile of fats, healthier preponderance of PUFAs and MUFAs, which are the good fats, relative to the poor fat, which is saturated fat. When we look at the micronutrient, vitamin D, we see that it's at 15% of the DV, so it is at least 10%. So it could be either one or the other, but in this case we have both. When we look at total fat at 4 grams, it's a little less. They have sodium that's focused on. There's no healthy fat profile in the D option, so it can't be that one. And the same thing for E. There's no healthy fat profile. There's only saturated fat. We don't see the PUFAs or the MUFAs, which are the polyunsaturates and the monounsaturates. And we see that the total fat is at 2 grams, which is low. So the correct answer then is C. The next question is sort of a prescription question. A 38-year-old female client whose DRI calories is 2,544 calories a day is prescribed a diet containing 45% carbs, 20 protein, and 35% fat. Identify below the gram representation of that prescription. Pause the video and calculate your answers. Now, the correct answer should be C. Now, why is it C? It's C because if you calculate 2544 calories, 2,544 calories, multiplied by 0.45, which is 45%, divide that by 4, you get 286. So the carbs at 286 is good. The protein then at 20%, we do the same calculation, 2544 times 0.2 divided by 4, and we get 127. So far, so good. And then we do fat at 35, so 0.35 times 2544, divide that by 9, and we get 98, or 99 if we round it up. And hence the correct answer is C. Here's a Mifflin equation, a time again to test your ability to resolve this in a timely manner. You're going to be referred to, though, to table 2.4 in your textbook for activity level. The activity level that's used here is going to be a light activity. And it's important also to recognize that you're not calculating here the REE with the Mifflin equation, but you're actually using the Mifflin equation and the activity factor to derive the total energy expenditure. So stop your video right here and then try to come up with the correct answer. If you did the calculation correctly, you should end up with A as the correct answer, 2,746. So let's see how this was done. And again, hopefully you've trained enough that you're able to get the results of this particular equation in about 45 to 50 seconds. So it always starts off with the body weight here, changing that into kilograms. So if you did it correctly, you should get 101.24 kilos. That gets multiplied by 10, and so you end up with 1012.42 in your first calculation. And then you do the height, and the height in this case is 5'7" or 67 inches times 2.54. And that gives you 170.18 centimeters times 6.25, and you get 1063.62, which then adds your previous result of 1012.42, and you should get in that first bracket 2076. Now, you should do the age. This is a woman, so it's 24 times 5 plus 161. That's 281. So 281 will subtract 2076. The result should be 1,795. You multiply that amount. Remember, we're not doing the REE, but the TEE. So you multiply that REE amount by 1.53, which is the light activity, and you get 2,746 kilocalories. All right, now here's a set of mini questions on carbohydrates. Again, these don't go towards your final grade. All right, the first question is to identify the disaccharide sugar that is mostly found in fruit. Remember, the key is that it's a disaccharide. So the correct answer is sucrose. Sucrose is indeed a disaccharide formed of glucose and fructose. Glucose is actually a monosaccharide, fructose is a monosaccharide, and lactose is a disaccharide formed of glucose and galactose. All right, identify the two monosaccharides that result from the activity of the digestive enzyme lactase on the sugar lactose. Stop your video here and select your answer. The correct answer should be D, galactose and glucose. Next question, which of the following monosaccharides are responsible for the sweet taste of fruit? Stop the video and select your answer. The correct answer is B, fructose. Fructose is indeed significantly more sweeter than glucose, and it is specifically the fructose that gives that prominent sweet taste. Here's the next question. Which of the following is not a complex carbohydrate? Stop the video and select your answer. So the correct answer is actually C, galactose. Galactose is a monosaccharide, so a one-unit sugar. Most fibers are actually complex carbs. Glycogen, even though it's in the muscle, is structured as a complex carb. And starches, as we know, the amylopectin and the amylose, these are actually complex carbs, complex starches. Now let's take a few minutes and do some fiber questions. So among the ingredients listed below, identify the one that consists mostly of insoluble fiber. Stop the video here, select your answer. If you remember, there are two types of fiber, insoluble and soluble. Insoluble fiber doesn't really absorb water, but it does draw water into the intestine. But because it doesn't solubilize in water, it doesn't have that ability to basically capture cholesterol. So the one that is the most insoluble is the wheat bran. The oat bran, the pectins, and the mucilage are all considered hydrocolloids, or soluble fibers that form a sort of a fermentation in the gastrointestinal gut. So in that sense, soluble fibers are fermentable, but insoluble fibers are not fermentable. Next question, identify the property that is associated with soluble fibers. Stop the video here and select your answer. The correct answer is C. They can lower the blood cholesterol. This is because they form hydrocolloids, or in other words, they are soluble to water, so they absorb the water, and in so doing, because of this solubility, they actually bind the cholesterol, and the cholesterol goes out into the fecal material. In fact, soluble fibers are viscous because of this solubility. They are also fermentable because of the fact that they attract water, they bind water, and because water is a favorite environment of bacteria, there's fermentation that takes place. What about the transit time of stool? When we say that stool has an increased transit time, that really means that it takes longer for the stool to go through the colon. When we say in this particular case that there's a decreased transit time, that means that the time to go through the colon is faster. Well, soluble fiber does not have that specific property. It's really the insoluble fibers that have that ability to decrease the transit time. Next question, what is the main health benefit associated with insoluble fiber? Stop the video here and select your answer. The answer is that it helps resolve constipation. It helps resolve constipation because of a decreased transit time, because it involves the drawing of water into the GI tract, causing a flushing effect of the stool, but it doesn't absorb the water. Here's another question. A man consumes 320 grams of sugar per day. Identify the number of pounds of sugar consumed by this man over a year. Pause the video and calculate your answer. All right, the correct answer is actually C. Let's see how I did it. So first of all, 320 grams per day, and there are 365 days in a year. So 320 times 365, and that leaves you with 116,800 grams. So you know that there are 454 grams in a pound, so therefore divide 116,800 by 454, and you get the answer, 257 pounds. Okay, this is the last question. A man consuming 1900 calories a day would be allowed no more than how many grams of total sugar per day if he followed the recommended total maximal sugar controlled diet? Pause here and calculate your answer. The correct answer is A. Let's see how I calculated that answer. So 1900 calories is what his DRI calories are, and we know simply that the maximal allowance for total sugar, as taught in this class, which is based on National Institute of Health data, is 20%. So let's calculate 20% of 1900 calories. So that's 1900 times 0.2, and we divide it by 4 because remembering that sugar is a carbohydrate, 4 calories per gram, and we get 95 grams. So this is the cutoff. So now I encourage students to practice on their own. It's important to perhaps gain access to the training quiz at the publisher's website. You can get there by using the access code and the web page in the inside cover of your textbook. That's one place to start. And at this stage, you would have a practice for concept check 2. And then I would also practice similar problems that you've encountered in this PowerPoint and just try to build up your efficiency in completing the Mifflin and Garrier equation in a timely manner.